Behind closed doors, entire families have been wiped out, their stories buried under fear and silence. Today we uncover some of the most brutal family massacres in modern history, crimes that shook communities and left scars that never healed. First, we got the chilling case of the Chauhan family massacre, the vanishing act that shocked Britain. In the cold month of February 2003, an entire family simply disappeared from their London home. No signs of struggle, no goodbye notes, no trace whatsoever. What started as a missing persons case would soon become one of the most chilling and brutal mass murders in British criminal history. 5 innocent lives were taken by men consumed with nothing but pure greed. This is the story of how evil destroyed the Chauhan family. The success story of Amarjit Chauhan. Amarjit Chauhan represented everything wonderful about the immigrant dream. Born in India, he arrived in Britain during his early 20s with nothing but hope and determination. Through years of hard work and smart business decisions, he built himself into a successful entrepreneur. By 2003, the 6-year-old had created Seba Freight, a thriving fruit and vegetable import business operating near London's Heathrow Airport. Despite his wealth, estimated to be in the millions, Amarjit remained humble. He lived in a modest bungalow in Heston, West London, with his beloved family. Those who knew him described him as cheerful, friendly, and generous. His business style was informal but clearly successful. He was always looking for new opportunities to grow his company and provide for his family. A close-knit family unit. Amarjit's world revolved around his family. His wife Nancy, 25 years old, was a loving mother who had moved to Britain from India. Together, they raised 2 young sons who brought joy to their lives every single day. 18-month-old Ravinder was a curious toddler full of energy and mischief. 8-week-old Devinder was their newest addition, a tiny baby who represented hope for the future. Nancy's mother, Charanjit Kaur, completed their household. The 1-year-old had worked as a teacher back in Punjab and was a deeply religious Sikh woman. In February 2003, she was visiting from India to help with the grandchildren and spend precious time with her daughter's family. Her prayer book never left her side, and she found comfort in her daily spiritual practices. The happy life that attracted deadly attention. The Chauhans lived what appeared to be a perfect life. Nancy would speak to her brother Onkar Verma in New Zealand almost every day. These conversations, filled with updates about little Ravinder's latest adventures and photos of baby Devinder, always brought smiles to everyone involved. The family seemed blessed with health, wealth, and happiness. Unfortunately, this success had caught the attention of dangerous people. Amarjit's thriving business would soon become the target of ruthless criminals who saw an opportunity to steal everything he had worked so hard to build. What they planned would go far beyond simple theft. It would become a complete annihilation of innocent lives. Kenneth Regan, a career criminal's new identity. The main threat to the Chauhan family came in the form of Kenneth Regan, a man with a long and violent criminal history. Also known by the alias Kenneth Avery, this 4-year-old had spent years involved in drug smuggling, money laundering, and passport fraud. His criminal empire had once been worth millions, but law enforcement had brought it crashing down. Regan had been imprisoned in 1998 for his involvement in a massive heroin smuggling operation and passport racketeering scheme. However, he had worked as a police informant, providing evidence against fellow criminals in exchange for early release. This supergrass arrangement allowed him to walk free in the summer of 2002, but he was required to assume a new identity for his protection. Despite his new name, Regan's appetite for wealth and power remained unchanged. Prison had not reformed him, to fret. It had only made him more desperate and dangerous. He craved the luxurious lifestyle his criminal activities had once provided, and he was willing to do anything to get it back. The perfect target, Seba Freight. In 2002, Regan managed to secure employment as a heavy goods vehicle driver at Seba Freight. To Amarjit and his employees, Regan appeared to be a reformed man looking for honest work. They had no idea they had welcomed a deadly predator into their midst. Regan quickly realized that Seba Freight would be perfect for his plans. The company's location near Heathrow Airport made it ideal for smuggling operations. Its established reputation and legitimate business operations would provide the perfect cover for moving illegal drugs and other contraband. All he needed to do was take control of the company. But Regan understood that simply stealing the business would not be enough. Amarjit would never willingly hand over his life's work. The employees and family members would ask questions. Law enforcement would investigate. For his plan to work, Regan needed to make the entire Chauhan family disappear permanently. Building the criminal network. Regan assembled a team of accomplices to help execute his deadly plan. William Hornsey, a 1-year-old from Bournemouth, had previously worked as an accountant but had fallen into a life of crime. In 1999, he had been sentenced for providing fake identities to international criminals. His expertise in document forgery would prove valuable for Regan's scheme. Peter Douglas Rees, who lived in Portsmouth, Hampshire, became the third member of their deadly trio. Originally from Bridport, Rees would serve as muscle to help control their victims during the kidnapping and murder phases of their operation. The final piece of Regan's plan involved Belinda Browen, though she had no idea she was being manipulated. The 43-year-old former public relations executive had been the best friend of television presenter Paula Yates. Regan had met Browen at a London nightclub in 1997 and had become obsessed with the glamorous socialite. When Browen moved to rural Devon in 2000, purchasing a 17th-century farm called Great Coalfield House near Tiverton, Regan saw an opportunity. The remote 50-acre estate would provide the perfect location to temporarily bury bodies. He renewed contact with Browen and planned to use her property without her knowledge. Throughout early 2003, Regan began making regular visits to CIBA Freight's offices. He told Amarjit about supposed Dutch investors who were interested in purchasing the company for £3 million in cash. This offer was designed to appeal to Amarjit's business instincts while luring him away from the safety of his normal routine. During this time, Regan was also assembling the materials he would need for his crime. From CIBA Freight's own warehouse, he stole rolls of brown packing tape that he would later use to restrain his victims. He acquired GHB, a powerful drug, commonly known as a date rape drug, which he planned to use to keep Amarjit subdued during the kidnapping. Everything was falling into place for what Regan believed would be the perfect crime. He would eliminate the Chauhan family, take over their business, and use it as a front for his drug smuggling operations. What he failed to anticipate was that his victims would not go quietly into the night. On the morning of the 13th of February 2003, Amarjit Chauhan left his office in Hounslow for what he believed would be a routine business meeting. He told his business partner Mike Parr that he was traveling to Wiltshire to meet with Dutch investors interested in buying CIBA Freight. The meeting location was near Stonehenge, a detail that should have seemed suspicious, but instead appeared legitimate to the trusting businessman. Amarjit's final words to his colleagues were optimistic. "I'm off to do a deal." He had no way of knowing that Kenneth Regan and his accomplices were waiting to spring their deadly trap. Instead of a business negotiation, Amarjit found himself face-to-face with armed criminals who quickly overpowered him. The kidnappers transported their victim to Regan's father's house in Forge Close, Wilton, near Salisbury in Wiltshire. This isolated location provided the perfect setting for what would follow. Amarjit was bound with the stolen packing tape, gagged to prevent him from calling for help, and repeatedly drugged with GHB to keep him manageable. Over the next several days, Amarjit endured unimaginable torture as his captors tried to force him to cooperate with their demands. Regan needed signed documents that would transfer ownership of CIBA Freight to him, making the takeover appear legitimate. He also wanted recorded messages that could be played to Amarjit's family to keep them from becoming suspicious. Despite the pain and fear he must have been experiencing, Amarjit showed remarkable courage and intelligence. Somehow, he managed to find a piece of paper, a bank letter addressed to Kenneth Regan at the Salisbury address. In a moment of brilliant thinking, he dated this letter, the 12th of February, and hid it inside his sock. This piece of evidence would later prove crucial in bringing his killers to justice. The businessman was forced to record voice messages for his wife Nancy, telling her that he would be away on business for several days. These recordings were designed to buy Regan time to eliminate the rest of the family before anyone became suspicious about the prolonged absence. Regan also forced Amarjit to sign a letter claiming that he was tired of life in England and wanted to return to India with his family. This document was meant to explain the family's sudden disappearance and make law enforcement believe they had left the country voluntarily. While Peter Rees remained in Salisbury to guard the tortured businessman, Regan and Hornsey traveled to London to complete their deadly mission. They arrived at the Chauhan family home in Hounslow, where Nancy was caring for her 2 young sons and her visiting mother. Using their knowledge of Amarjit's situation, the killers were able to convince Nancy to let them into the house. They may have told her they had news about her husband or claimed they needed to collect something on his behalf. Once inside, they overpowered the helpless family members. Nancy Chauhan, just 25 years old, was murdered along with her innocent children. 18-month-old Ravinder and 8-week-old Devinder had their lives cut short before they could even begin to experience the world. Charanjit Kaur, the devoted grandmother who had traveled from India to spend time with her family, also fell victim to the killer's brutality. The exact methods used to kill the family members were never definitively established, as the bodies were too decomposed when finally recovered. However, investigators believe they were most likely strangled to death. The scene must have been horrific, with children's toys scattered around and meals left unfinished as evidence of how suddenly the violence had erupted. After completing their massacre, Regan and Hornsey loaded all 5 bodies into a hired van. They drove through the night to Devon, where they would temporarily bury their victims on Belinda Bruin's remote farm property. The killers dug a trench large enough to hold an entire family and covered the gravesite with aggregate to hide their crime. On the 17th of February, Regan arrived at Seba Freight with the forged documents claiming to give him control of the company. He presented Amarjit's handwritten letter and a power of attorney that supposedly transferred ownership. However, the employees immediately became suspicious. Amarjit almost always wrote his correspondence by hand, but these documents looked different. Something didn't feel right about the situation. Meanwhile, Nancy's brother Onkar Verma in New Zealand was growing increasingly worried. His daily phone calls to his sister had suddenly stopped, and no one was answering at the Chauhan household. When he called Seba Freight, employees told him that Amarjit had supposedly taken the family back to India, but this explanation didn't make sense. Nancy would never have left without saying goodbye, and her mother's return ticket to India was still in the house. As the days passed, more people began asking questions about the Chauhan family's sudden disappearance. Bank accounts remained untouched, suggesting the family had not actually left the country. Friends and neighbors reported that personal belongings, including Charanjit Kaur's precious prayer book, had been left behind, something that would never happen if the family had planned to relocate permanently. Onkar Verma refused to accept the official explanations and contacted the police. Initially, law enforcement was reluctant to investigate, believing that the family had simply chosen to leave England without informing anyone. It was not unusual for immigrant families to return to their home countries, especially if they were facing legal or financial difficulties. However, Verma's persistence eventually paid off. He flew from New Zealand to London in early March 2003 to search for his missing family members himself. When he arrived at their home on the 5th of March, he found clear evidence that something terrible had happened. The washing machine was still full of wet clothes, suggesting the family had been interrupted in the middle of their daily routine. The breakthrough in the case came on the 22nd of April 2003, when father and son canoeists David and Carl Chapman were paddling in the waters near Bournemouth Pier in Dorset. They spotted what initially appeared to be a swimmer in distress floating in the sea. Upon closer inspection, they realized they had found a dead body. The corpse was in a highly decomposed state, making immediate identification impossible. The man was wearing jeans, black shoes, and a purple top. Most disturbing of all, his head and face had been wrapped in brown packing tape, covering what appeared to be a large wound to the skull. This was clearly not an accidental death. When the body was finally identified as Amarjit Chauhan, the missing persons case immediately became a murder investigation. The condition of the remains and the circumstances of their discovery pointed to foul play of the most serious nature. Scotland Yard launched one of the most intensive manhunts in their history. During the examination of Amarjit's body, investigators made a crucial discovery. Hidden inside one of his socks was the folded piece of paper he had managed to conceal during his captivity. The bank letter addressed to Kenneth Regan and dated the 12th of February provided the first solid link between the victim and his killer. This evidence was like a message from beyond the grave. Even in his final moments, Amarjit had been thinking about justice and ensuring his family's killers would be caught. The letter would prove to be the key piece of evidence that would eventually bring down the entire criminal operation. Autopsy results revealed that Amarjit had been drugged with unusually high levels of GHB, confirming that he had been held captive and tortured before his death. The packing tape used to wrap his head was traced back to supplies that had been stolen from his own warehouse, adding another layer of cruelty to an already horrific crime. Armed with evidence linking Kenneth Regan to the murder, police began tracking his movements and associates. Phone records showed that Regan's and Amarjit's mobile phones had traveled together on the day of the businessman's disappearance, placing the suspected killer at the scene of the crime. Investigators also looked into Regan's relationship with Belinda Bruin. When they learned about her remote Devon farm and Regan's access to the property, they realized they might have found the location where the bodies had been initially buried. Bruin herself provided crucial information when she contacted police after recognizing Regan's face on television news reports. On Easter Sunday, 2003, police launched a massive search operation at Great Coalfield House. They found evidence that bodies had indeed been buried there. Clothing and jewelry belonging to Amarjit Chauhan were discovered in the excavated trench. However, the bodies themselves were gone, confirming investigators' worst fears about what had happened to the rest of the family. Realizing that the police net was closing around them, Regan and Hornsey made a desperate attempt to throw investigators off their trail. Regan contacted police, claiming he had arranged to meet Amarjit at a bronze pig statue in Newport, South Wales. He suggested that if officers came to observe this meeting, they would see that the businessman was alive and well. This elaborate hoax was designed to make police believe that Amarjit was still alive and that Regan was innocent of any wrongdoing. However, investigators saw through the deception immediately. The location of a bronze pig statue was clearly chosen to mock law enforcement, efek, pig being a derogatory slang term for police officers. When no one appeared at the meeting location, it became clear that Regan was attempting to manipulate the investigation. This failed scheme only served to further implicate him in the crimes and demonstrated the calculated nature of his criminal mind. On the 7th of May, 2003, Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey fled Britain via the port of Dover, traveling to France under false identities. They were believed to be heading for Spain, hoping to disappear into the criminal underworld of southern Europe. Peter Rees went into hiding in Gloucestershire, staying with friends who were unaware of his involvement in the murders. Scotland Yard immediately launched an international manhunt, working with Interpol and European law enforcement agencies to track down the fugitives. The case received massive media attention throughout Europe, with Regan and Hornsey's photographs displayed on television and in newspapers across multiple countries. The first arrest came on the 14th of May 2003, when Peter Rees was taken into custody in Britain. Under intense interrogation, he eventually began cooperating with police and providing details about the crimes. His testimony would prove crucial in understanding exactly what had happened to the Chohan family. Kenneth Regan was arrested in Belgium on the 2nd of August 2003, after months on the run. William Hornsey was tracked down at a campsite near Derby in the Ardennes region of Belgium, where he had been using the false identity, William Smith. Both men were extradited back to Britain to face justice for their crimes. The trial of Kenneth Regan, William Hornsey, and Peter Rees began in 2005 at London's famous Old Bailey Courthouse. It would become the longest murder trial in the history of the Metropolitan Police, lasting 8 months and costing over £10 million. The judge spent a record-breaking 5 weeks just producing the case summary. Prosecutors presented nearly 4,500 pieces of evidence, including financial records, phone tracking data, witness testimony, and forensic analysis. The case painted a picture of premeditated murder motivated purely by greed. Richard Horwell, the lead prosecutor, told the jury that the most chilling aspect of the crime was how the killers had planned from the beginning to eliminate Amarjit's entire family. The evidence against the defendants was overwhelming. Phone records proved they had been together during the kidnapping. Forged documents showed their attempts to steal Seba freight. Witness testimony from Belinda Bruin described the unauthorized digging on her property. Most damning of all was the hidden letter that Amarjit had managed to conceal in his sock. The defense team attempted several strategies to deflect blame from their clients. They suggested that Amarjit Chohan had been involved in illegal activities himself and had fled the country voluntarily. They claimed their clients had been forced to bury the bodies by an Asian criminal gang that had actually committed the murders. Some defense arguments focused on the financial motive, questioning whether the crime made economic sense. They pointed out that khat, a stimulant drug that Seba Freight was suspected of smuggling, was legal in Britain and relatively inexpensive. Why would anyone commit such brutal murders over a business that dealt in legal substances? However, these arguments fell apart under scrutiny. The overwhelming physical evidence, combined with witness testimony and the defendants' own suspicious behavior, made it clear that they were guilty of the crimes. Their attempted flight to Europe and the elaborate cover-up schemes demonstrated consciousness of guilt. On the 1st of July 2005, after months of testimony and deliberation, the verdicts were announced. Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey were found guilty of murdering all 5 members of the Chohan family. They were sentenced to life imprisonment with whole life orders, meaning they would never be eligible for parole. Peter Rees was convicted of murdering Amarjit Chohan and assisting in the cover-up, but was cleared of the other 4 murder charges due to his cooperation with police. He was sentenced to 23 years in prison for his role in the crimes. Judge Stephen Mitchell delivered a scathing condemnation of the defendants during sentencing. He told them, "Your crimes are uniquely terrible. The cold-blooded murders of an 8-week-old baby and one 8-month-old toddler, not to mention the murder of their mother, father, and grandmother, provide a chilling insight into the utterly perverted standards by which you have lived your lives. Your characters are as despicable as your crimes. Each of you is a practiced, resourceful, and manipulative liar." Despite the convictions, the Chohan family case remains incomplete in one crucial aspect. While the bodies of Amarjit and Nancy Chauhan were eventually recovered from the waters off the Dorset coast, the remains of their 2 young sons and Nancy's mother were never found. In July 2003, Nancy's body was discovered floating in Poole Bay, and in November, Charanjit Kaur's decomposed remains washed up on the Isle of Wight. However, little Ravinder and baby Devinder were never recovered. Investigators believe their small bodies were thrown into the English Channel, where they sank to the bottom and were lost forever. This tragic reality means that the family can never be properly laid to rest together, adding an extra layer of pain to an already devastating crime. The fact that the children's bodies were never found also meant that the exact cause of death for all family members could never be definitively established. The advanced decomposition of the recovered bodies made it impossible for forensic experts to determine precisely how each victim had died. Impact on the surviving family. The murders had a devastating impact on Onkar Verma, Nancy's brother, who had fought so hard to get the case investigated. Speaking after the trial, he expressed his complete devastation. "I can't describe my feelings in words how I feel. I've lost my family, and nothing can bring them back. It has to be lust for money or hatred to kill innocent people, innocent kids." Verma had not only lost his sister, mother, and 2 young nephews, but he also had to live with the knowledge that their bodies had never been properly recovered. The pain was compounded by his awareness of how slowly the investigation had initially progressed and how racial prejudice may have played a role in the case not being taken seriously from the beginning. Support groups and victim advocacy organizations rallied around Verma, providing assistance as he tried to rebuild his life after such an unimaginable loss. However, no amount of support could truly heal the wounds left by such a brutal and senseless crime. Lessons for law enforcement. The Chauhan family murders exposed significant weaknesses in how missing persons cases involving immigrant families were initially handled. The assumption that the family had simply returned home delayed the investigation and allowed the killers more time to cover their tracks and flee the country. The case led to important changes in police procedures for handling missing persons reports. Law enforcement agencies developed better protocols for recognizing when disappearances might involve foul play, regardless of the ethnicity or immigration status of the missing individuals. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of international cooperation in tracking down criminals who flee across borders. The successful arrests of Regan and Hornsey in Belgium showed how effective coordination between law enforcement agencies could bring even the most elusive fugitives to justice. The wider criminal network. The investigation into the Chauhan murders revealed connections to other unsolved crimes. Kenneth Regan and William Hornsey were later named as suspects in the 1992 disappearance of Michael Shalamak, a 53-year-old man who went missing from Southampton. The main similarity between the cases was a letter sent from France, suggesting the same methods of deception had been used. This revelation raised disturbing questions about how many other victims these criminals might have claimed over the years. Regan's long history of drug smuggling, money laundering, and violence suggested that the Chauhan family might not have been their only victims. However, despite ongoing investigations, no additional murders were ever definitively linked to the group. The case also highlighted the dangers of the early release program for criminal informants. Regan's status as a supergrass had allowed him to gain early release from prison, during which time he planned and executed the massacre of an entire family. This raised serious questions about whether the potential benefits of criminal cooperation outweighed the risks of releasing dangerous individuals back into society. Conclusion: a legacy of loss and learning. The ultimate price of greed. The Chauhan family massacre stands as one of the most brutal and senseless crimes in modern British history. 5 innocent lives were destroyed by men whose only motivation was financial gain. Amarjit Chauhan had worked hard to build a successful business and provide for his family, only to have everything stolen by criminals who saw his success as an opportunity for their own enrichment. The case serves as a stark reminder of how greed can drive people to commit unspeakable acts of violence. Regan and his accomplices were not content with simply stealing money or property. They felt compelled to eliminate an entire family to avoid potential consequences for their actions. This level of brutality shocked even experienced law enforcement officers who had seen many violent crimes throughout their careers. The strength of the human spirit. Despite the horrific nature of their ordeal, the Chauhan family members showed remarkable courage in their final moments. Amarjit's decision to hide evidence in his sock demonstrated clear thinking and determination to see justice done, even when facing torture and death. His actions ultimately led to the conviction of his killers and prevented them from committing additional crimes. Nancy Chauhan's daily phone calls to her brother in New Zealand had created a pattern that quickly alerted family members when something went wrong. Her close relationship with Onkar Verma ensured that the family's disappearance would not go unnoticed or uninvestigated. This family bond ultimately played a crucial role in bringing the killers to justice. The ongoing fight for justice. The conviction of Kenneth Regan, William Hornsey, and Peter Reese provided some measure of justice for the Chauhan family, but it could never truly heal the wounds left by such a devastating crime. The fact that two young children's bodies were never recovered means that complete closure remains elusive for the surviving family members. Onkar Verma and other relatives continue to honor the memory of their lost loved ones while advocating for improvements in how law enforcement handles missing persons cases. Their efforts have helped ensure that future families facing similar tragedies will receive more immediate and thorough investigations. A case that changed Britain. The Chauhan family murders had a lasting impact on British society, highlighting issues of racial prejudice in law enforcement and the vulnerability of immigrant communities to violent crime. The case sparked important conversations about how police respond to missing persons reports and whether cultural assumptions affect the quality of investigations. The lengthy and expensive trial demonstrated the commitment of the British justice system to holding even the most dangerous criminals accountable for their actions. The whole life sentences given to Regan and Hornsey sent a clear message that such brutal crimes would face the full force of the law. Remembering the victims. Today, more than 20 years after their deaths, the Chauhan family members are remembered not as victims of a brutal crime, but as individuals who lived full and meaningful lives before they were cut short. Amarjit Chauhan's legacy as a successful businessman and loving father continues to inspire others pursuing their own dreams of success. Nancy Chauhan is remembered as a devoted mother and daughter who maintained strong family connections across international boundaries. Her daily phone calls to her brother demonstrate the importance of family relationships and how love can transcend geographical distance. Little Ravinder and baby Devinder never had the chance to grow up and make their own mark on the world, but their memory serves as a reminder of the preciousness of innocent life. Their grandmother, Charanjit Kaur, is remembered as a woman of strong faith who traveled across the world to spend time with her family. The final word. The Chauhan family massacre remains one of the most shocking crimes in British criminal history, LOT, a stark reminder that evil can strike anywhere, at any time, often targeting those who least deserve it. However, it also demonstrates the power of persistence, love, and justice to ultimately prevail over even the most carefully planned criminal schemes. Kenneth Regan believed he had committed the perfect crime, but he failed to account for the strength of family bonds, the dedication of law enforcement, and the courage of his victims. Today, he and his accomplices will spend the rest of their lives in prison, while the memory of the Chauhan family lives on as a testament to the importance of fighting for justice, no matter how difficult the battle may seem. The case serves as a powerful reminder that every life has value, every family deserves protection, and every crime, no matter how carefully planned, will eventually face the consequences of justice. In the end, love and truth proved stronger than greed and violence, ensuring that the Chauhan family's legacy would be one of justice rather than tragedy. Secondly, we got the haunting case of the Bennett family massacre, solved 3 decades later. On a freezing winter night in 1984, an evil so pure and brutal crept into a family home in Aurora, Colorado. What happened next would shake an entire community to its core and haunt investigators for nearly 4 decades. 3 innocent lives were taken, a child was left clinging to life, and a killer vanished into the shadows. This is the story of the Bennett family massacre, TO, a case that would remain cold for 37 years until science finally caught up with evil. In the early 1980 seconds, Bruce and Deborah Bennett represented everything beautiful about young love and the American dream. Bruce, a 27-year-old Navy veteran, had served his country as a sonar analyst before returning to civilian life with hopes of building something meaningful. Deborah, 26, had met Bruce through her brother Larry, and their connection was instant and deep. Together, they had created a life filled with love, ambition, and endless possibilities. The couple had recently purchased their first home in Aurora, Colorado, in 1983. It was a modest but comfortable house that represented years of saving and planning. Bruce and Deborah ran a family furniture distribution business together, working side by side to build their future. Bruce was also studying to become an air traffic controller, always looking for ways to provide better for his growing family. Their home was filled with laughter and the joy that only young children can bring. The couple had been blessed with 2 beautiful daughters who were the center of their universe. Every decision they made was with these girls in mind. Every dream they shared included watching their children grow up, happy and safe. 7-year-old Melissa Bennett was everything parents could hope for in a daughter. Born in 1976, she was bright, curious, and full of life. Melissa loved music and had recently shown interest in learning to play instruments. Her grandmother Connie had bought her a chord organ from a thrift store as an early birthday present, and Melissa had spent hours that very Sunday evening learning to pick out melodies. The 16th of January, 1984, was supposed to be a special day, 2 days. In just 2 days, Melissa would turn 8 years old. The family had been celebrating early, filled with the excitement that comes with childhood birthdays. There were plans to make, presents to wrap, and friends to invite. Melissa had no way of knowing that this would be her last birthday celebration. She was a loving big sister who took her role seriously. Melissa helped care for her younger sister and often played the part of the responsible older child. Her parents were proud of how mature and caring she was, always looking out for others and spreading joy wherever she went. 3-year-old Vanessa Bennett was the apple of everyone's eye. Born in 1981, she was still just a toddler, full of the wonder and innocence that makes young childhood so precious. Vanessa looked up to her big sister Melissa and followed her everywhere, trying to copy everything she did. The little girl had no understanding of danger or evil. Her world was filled with toys, bedtime stories, and the secure feeling that comes from being surrounded by people who love you unconditionally. Bruce and Deborah treasured every moment with their youngest daughter, knowing how quickly these precious early years pass by. Vanessa's presence brought light to every room she entered. Her giggles and childhood babble filled the house with warmth and reminded everyone of the simple joys in life. She was too young to understand that some people in the world meant harm to others, too innocent to imagine that evil could touch her safe, loving home. The Bennett family was surrounded by love from their extended family. Bruce's mother, Connie Bennett, was deeply involved in their lives and adored her son's family. She worked alongside Bruce and Deborah in the family furniture business and was a constant source of support and wisdom. Connie had spent that fateful Sunday evening with the family, teaching Melissa how to play the chord organ and enjoying precious time with her granddaughters. When she left around 9 p.m. that night, she was already looking forward to her next visit. She had promised to give Melissa more music lessons if the little girl stayed interested in learning. The family had strong connections throughout the community. Deborah's brother Larry remained close to the family after introducing Bruce and Deborah. They had friends, neighbors, and business associates who cared about them and would have done anything to protect them from harm. This network of love and support made what happened next even more devastating. So many people's lives would be shattered by the evil that visited the Bennett home that night. The ripple effects of violence would spread far beyond the immediate family, touching everyone who knew and loved them. January 1984 was a time when most people in the Denver area felt safe in their homes. Crime existed, of course, but random, brutal attacks on families were rare. People left their garage doors open, trusted their neighbors, and believed that evil was something that happened to other people in other places. This sense of security would be shattered over 12 terrifying days as a predator stalked the suburban neighborhoods around Denver. What started as isolated incidents would quickly reveal themselves to be the work of one man, a killer so brutal and senseless that he would become known as the Colorado Hammer Killer. The attacks began on the 4th of January, 1984, when James and Kimberly Haubenschild were sleeping peacefully in their Aurora home. An intruder slipped inside and began beating them with a hammer while they slept. Both suffered terrible injuries. James had a fractured skull, and Kimberly sustained a severe concussion. Miraculously, both survived, though they were left with lasting trauma from the unprovoked attack. At first, investigators treated this as an isolated incident. Random home invasions were unusual but not unheard of. The couple had survived, which was fortunate, and perhaps this was just a burglar who had panicked when discovered. There was no way to know that this was just the beginning of a reign of terror that would claim multiple innocent lives. On the 9th of January, the attacks took a more sinister turn. A 28-year-old flight attendant named Donna Holm pulled into her Aurora garage after a long day of work. As she was getting out of her car, a man appeared and brutally attacked her with a hammer. The assault was savage and included sexual violence, demonstrating that this wasn't just about robbery or burglary gone wrong. Donna survived her horrific ordeal, but barely. Her injuries were severe, and the trauma would haunt her for the rest of her life. The attack showed a clear escalation in the perpetrator's violence and depravity. This wasn't someone who killed in the heat of the moment. This was a predator who enjoyed causing pain and suffering. Law enforcement began to see patterns emerging. The attacks were happening in Aurora. They involved hammers as weapons, and there seemed to be a sexual component to the violence. However, they still didn't fully grasp the scope of what they were dealing with. the worst was yet to come. On the 10th of January, 1984, the killer crossed a line from which there would be no return. Patricia Louise Smith, a 50-year-old interior decorator, was alone in her Lakewood home when evil knocked on her door. Patricia was a beloved mother and grandmother who had spent her life creating beautiful spaces for others to enjoy. The attack on Patricia was beyond brutal. She was sexually assaulted and beaten to death with an auto-body hammer. The killer showed no mercy, no humanity, no hesitation in taking the life of this innocent woman. When her body was discovered, it was covered with a Winnie the Pooh blanket, a detail that added an extra layer of disturbing contrast to the horrific scene. Patricia's murder marked a turning point in the killer's evolution from someone who injured his victims to someone who was willing to take lives. The brutality of her death shocked even experienced investigators who had seen many violent crimes throughout their careers. This was not the work of someone who killed out of desperation or fear. This was the work of a true predator. The Lakewood police immediately recognized the similarities to the Aurora attacks. The use of a hammer as a weapon, the sexual violence, the random nature of the crime, all pointed to the same perpetrator. A task force was formed to coordinate between jurisdictions and pool resources to catch this dangerous individual before he could strike again. Investigators began to understand the killer's preferred method of operation. He targeted homes where garage doors had been left open, providing easy access without having to break down doors or windows. This showed a level of planning and patience that indicated he was becoming more sophisticated in his approach to selecting victims. The hammer seemed to be his weapon of choice, though he was willing to use knives and other implements when available. The brutality of his attacks was consistent. He used far more violence than necessary to subdue his victims, suggesting that the violence itself was part of what motivated him. Most disturbing of all was the sexual component of many attacks. This wasn't someone who assaulted victims as an afterthought. The sexual violence appeared to be a primary motivation for the crimes. This detail helped investigators understand that they were dealing with a serial predator who would not stop killing until he was caught. The randomness of his target selection made him particularly dangerous. There was no pattern in terms of victim demographics that people could use to protect themselves. Young or old, single or married, rich or poor, no one was safe from this killer's attention. Sunday, the 15th of January, 1984, began as a perfectly ordinary day for the Bennett family. Bruce and Deborah spent time with their daughters, enjoying the relaxed pace that comes with weekend family time. There was excitement in the air because Melissa's 8th birthday was just 2 days away, and the family was already beginning to celebrate. Connie Bennett arrived that evening to spend time with her granddaughters and help with the early birthday festivities. She had brought along a chord organ she'd found at a thrift store, thinking Melissa might enjoy learning to play music. The little girl was delighted with the gift and spent considerable time that evening learning to pick out simple melodies. The house was filled with the sounds of family life, children laughing, adults talking, the tentative notes of a beginner trying to master a new instrument. It was the kind of evening that creates precious memories, the kind of moment that families treasure and look back on with warmth for years to come. As the evening wound down, relatives began to leave. One of Melissa's uncles noticed that the garage door was still open and casually mentioned to Bruce that he should close it before going to bed. It was an innocent reminder, the kind of practical advice that family members share, to look out for one another's safety and security. This simple observation would later take on tragic significance. The open garage door would provide the entry point that the killer needed to access the Bennett home. What should have been a minor oversight would become the detail that sealed this family's fate. Around 9 p.m., Connie Bennett kissed her granddaughters goodnight and headed home. She was already looking forward to her next visit and to giving Melissa more music lessons if the little girl remained interested in learning to play. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last time she would see her son's family alive and happy. After their guests departed, Bruce and Deborah began the familiar routine of putting their daughters to bed. 7-year-old Melissa was excited about her upcoming birthday but also tired from the day's activities. 3-year-old Vanessa needed the kind of attention that toddlers require, help brushing teeth, getting into pajamas, and settling down for the night. The parents took turns reading bedtime stories and tucking their daughters into their beds. These were the precious moments that make parenthood worthwhile, the quiet conversations, gentle kisses goodnight, and whispered, "I love yous," that bond families together. Bruce and Deborah had no way of knowing these would be their final acts as parents. The house grew quiet as the family settled in for the night. Bruce and Deborah retired to their own bedroom, probably discussing the week ahead, Melissa's birthday plans, and the routine concerns of young parents trying to build a life together. The garage door remained open, a detail that had been forgotten in the comfort and security of their family routine. Outside in the cold Colorado night, evil was approaching their home. The killer had been hunting for his next victims, and the open garage door made the Bennett house an irresistible target. As the family slept peacefully, unaware of the danger approaching, their lives hung in the balance. Monday morning, the 16th of January, 1984, should have been a normal start to a normal week. Bruce and Deborah were expected at their furniture store to handle the day's business operations. When they failed to appear at their usual time, concern began to grow among family members and business associates. Phone calls to the Bennett home went unanswered. This was unusual behavior for the responsible couple who took their business obligations seriously. As the morning progressed without any word from Bruce or Deborah, family members knew something was seriously wrong. Connie Bennett made the decision to drive to her son's house to check on the family. She was worried, but trying to remain optimistic. Perhaps someone was sick, or there had been a family emergency that prevented them from calling. She couldn't have imagined the nightmare that awaited her discovery. When Connie arrived at the house, she immediately noticed that the garage door remained open from the previous night. This detail struck her as odd, knowing that Bruce was usually careful about home security. As she approached the house, an overwhelming sense of dread began to build in the pit of her stomach. What Connie Bennett discovered when she entered her son's home was beyond human comprehension. The scene was so brutal, so senseless, so completely devastating that it would haunt her for the rest of her life. No parent should ever have to see what she saw that morning, and no family should ever have to endure what the Bennetts experienced. Bruce Bennett's body was found crumpled near the bottom of the stairs. The 7-year-old Navy veteran had fought desperately to protect his family, engaging in a fierce struggle with the intruder. Evidence of his heroic battle was everywhere. He had suffered defensive wounds from trying to ward off a knife, and his throat had been slashed as he continued to fight for his family's lives. The killer had used both a hammer and a kitchen knife taken from the Bennett's own home to attack Bruce. Despite being overpowered by his attacker, Bruce had fought until his final breath, trying to give his wife and children time to escape or hide. His sacrifice demonstrated the kind of love and courage that defines true parenthood. Upstairs, the horror continued. Deborah Bennett was found dead in the bedroom she shared with her husband. The 6-year-old mother had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death with the same hammer that had claimed her husband's life. Her final moments were filled with terror and pain, dying far from the safety and love she deserved. 7-year-old Melissa Bennett was discovered in her bedroom, her small body bearing evidence of the same brutal treatment. The little girl who had been so excited about her upcoming 8th birthday had been sexually assaulted and murdered by a man who showed no mercy even to children. Her face was covered by a blanket, a detail that somehow made the crime even more disturbing. In the midst of this unimaginable carnage, Connie Bennett made a discovery that would prove to be both a blessing and a source of lifelong anguish. 3-year-old Vanessa Bennett was found barely alive, her tiny body broken but still breathing. The child was unconscious and critically injured, but somehow she had survived the attack that claimed her family. Vanessa's injuries were catastrophic and would have killed most people. Her skull was shattered, her jaw was broken, and multiple bones throughout her small body were fractured. The toddler had also been sexually assaulted, adding trauma beyond physical injury. She was immediately rushed to the hospital, where medical teams fought desperately to save her life. The discovery of Vanessa alive provided both hope and horror. Hope because at least one member of the Bennett family had survived this brutal attack. Horror because a 3-year-old child had endured violence that no human being should ever experience, and she would carry the physical and emotional scars for the rest of her life. Doctors worked around the clock to stabilize Vanessa's condition. She required 3 units of blood and several units of fluids just to keep her alive. Her injuries were so severe that medical professionals weren't certain she would survive, and even if she did, they couldn't predict what kind of recovery might be possible. The Bennett home became one of the most thoroughly investigated crime scenes in Colorado history. Experienced detectives who had seen many violent crimes were shocked by the level of brutality displayed in this attack. The killer had used excessive violence far beyond what was necessary to subdue his victims, indicating that the violence itself was a source of satisfaction. Investigators found evidence of the fierce battle Bruce Bennett had waged to protect his family. Blood evidence showed the path of the struggle from the bottom of the stairs through multiple rooms of the house. Bruce had been slashed with a kitchen knife as he fought, and his throat had been cut, but he had continued fighting until he was finally overcome by hammer blows. The killer had left behind numerous pieces of evidence that would prove crucial decades later when DNA technology improved. Blood, hair, and other biological materials were carefully collected and preserved. A piece of carpet from under Melissa's body was removed and stored. A comforter from the little girl's bed was also preserved for future analysis. Perhaps most importantly, investigators found distinctive footprints throughout the house that did not belong to any family member or recent visitor. These blood-stained boot prints provided a physical link to the killer and would remain a crucial piece of evidence throughout the investigation. Outside the home, investigators found additional evidence of the killer's presence. A kitchen butcher knife believed to be one of the murder weapons was recovered from the front yard, with snow still clinging to the blade. This suggested the attack had occurred during the overnight hours when snow was falling. News of the Bennett family massacre sent shockwaves throughout the Denver metropolitan area. This wasn't an isolated incident involving people involved in dangerous activities. This was a random attack on an innocent family in their own home. If it could happen to the Bennetts, it could happen to anyone. Parents throughout the region began double-checking their locks, closing garage doors that might previously have been left open, and looking over their shoulders when arriving home after dark. The sense of security that had existed in suburban Denver was shattered by this senseless violence. Local media covered the story extensively, warning residents to be vigilant and report any suspicious activity. However, the random nature of the attacks made it difficult for people to know how to protect themselves. There was no pattern in victim selection that people could avoid, no common thread that explained why these particular families had been targeted. Schools and community organizations held meetings to discuss safety measures and provide support for families struggling to cope with the fear that gripped the area. Mental health professionals noted increased anxiety levels throughout the community as people grappled with the reality that such evil could exist so close to home. Recognizing that they were dealing with a serial killer, law enforcement agencies throughout the Denver area formed a task force to coordinate their investigation efforts. The similarities between the Bennett murders and the earlier attacks were too strong to ignore. To see, this was clearly the work of the same individual. Detective teams worked around the clock to analyze evidence, interview witnesses, and follow up on tips from concerned citizens. The pressure to solve these cases was enormous, both from the community demanding justice and from investigators' own desire to stop this killer before he could claim more victims. Investigators reached out to FBI profilers to help them understand what kind of person they were looking for. The profile that emerged was of a young white male, probably in his 20s, with a history of violence and sexual assault. He was likely familiar with the area and comfortable moving around suburban neighborhoods at night. The killer appeared to be escalating his violence with each attack. He had progressed from non-fatal assaults to murder, and the brutality of his attacks was increasing. Experts warned that if he wasn't caught soon, more families would likely be victimized. The search for evidence. Every possible lead was pursued with desperate intensity. Investigators canvassed neighborhoods looking for witnesses who might have seen suspicious activity. They checked with local hospitals to see if anyone had been treated for injuries that might be consistent with being involved in a violent struggle. Hardware stores throughout the area were contacted to see if anyone remembered selling hammers to suspicious customers. Pawn shops were checked for stolen items that might have been taken from the victims' homes. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, was carefully analyzed and preserved. The investigation consumed enormous resources as multiple agencies committed their best investigators to the case. Hundreds of tips poured in from concerned citizens, each one requiring follow-up to determine whether it might lead to the killer. Despite these massive efforts, the killer remained elusive. He had managed to commit these brutal crimes without leaving behind clear evidence of his identity. The investigation was further complicated by the limited forensic technology available in 1984. DNA analysis was in its early stages and couldn't provide the definitive answers that would later prove crucial. 3-year-old Vanessa Bennett faced a recovery process that would last for years and present challenges that no child should ever have to overcome. Her physical injuries were severe enough that doctors weren't initially certain she would survive, and even after she stabilized, the extent of her disabilities became clear. Vanessa suffered from paralysis on her left side, requiring extensive physical therapy to regain basic motor functions. Her shattered jaw had to be wired shut, and she needed feeding tubes to receive nutrition during her early recovery. The toddler who had once run and played like any normal child now faced the prospect of learning to walk all over again. Her skull fractures resulted in lasting brain injury that would affect her cognitive abilities and emotional regulation for the rest of her life. The trauma to her developing brain meant that she would struggle with memory, attention, and impulse control as she grew older. Simple tasks that other children took for granted became major challenges for Vanessa. The physical therapy process was grueling for such a young child. Vanessa had to relearn basic skills like walking, talking, and feeding herself. She wore leg braces similar to those depicted in the movie Forrest Gump, and her progress was slow and often painful. Beyond the physical challenges, Vanessa faced emotional and psychological trauma that would haunt her throughout her childhood and into adulthood. She had no memory of her parents or sister, no recollection of the loving family she had been part of before the attack. Her earliest memories were of hospitals, pain, and the confusing world of medical treatments and therapy. Connie Bennett faced the unimaginable task of rebuilding her life after discovering her murdered family and taking responsibility for her surviving granddaughter. At 47 years old, she suddenly found herself responsible for raising a severely traumatized and disabled child while dealing with her own overwhelming grief. The images from that January morning were seared into Connie's memory forever. She could never escape the vision of her son's broken body, her daughter-in-law's violated remains, and her granddaughter's blood-covered bedroom. These memories haunted her daily, making it impossible to find peace or closure. In addition to her emotional trauma, Connie faced enormous financial challenges. Medical bills for Vanessa's treatment and ongoing care were staggering. The furniture business that Bruce and Deborah had built together struggled without their leadership and energy. Insurance policies and government assistance helped, but the financial burden of caring for a disabled child while dealing with grief was overwhelming. Connie also lived in constant fear that the killer would return to finish what he had started. She moved several times, always worried that the man who had destroyed her family might come back for Vanessa. Every strange noise at night, every unexpected knock at the door, brought back the terror of that January morning. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Connie showed remarkable strength and dedication in raising Vanessa. She provided the love and stability that the traumatized child desperately needed, becoming both grandmother and primary parent in circumstances that no one should have to face. As months turned to years without any breakthrough in the case, the Bennett family murders became one of Colorado's most notorious cold cases. Investigators had collected substantial evidence from the crime scene, but the forensic technology of the 1,980 seconds wasn't advanced enough to identify the killer from the biological materials they had preserved. The task force continued their work, but other cases demanded attention and resources were limited. Tips still came in periodically, but none led to the breakthrough that investigators desperately hoped for. The killer seemed to have vanished without a trace after the Bennett murders. What investigators didn't know was that the killer had actually been captured just days after the Bennett murders, but for crimes committed in other states. He would spend the next several decades in prison, unknown to Colorado authorities who continued their search for answers. The failure to solve such a high-profile case weighed heavily on the investigators involved. Many of them carried the Bennett case with them throughout their careers, never forgetting the brutality of the crimes or the family members still waiting for justice. Growing up as the sole survivor of such a brutal crime presented unique challenges that Vanessa struggled to overcome throughout her childhood. Other children at school often made cruel comments about her situation, calling her parents' killer the Hammer Man and suggesting that he might come for her friends if they spent time at her house. These thoughtless comments from other children compounded Vanessa's existing trauma and made it difficult for her to form normal friendships. She was already dealing with learning disabilities and behavioral problems related to her brain injury, and the social isolation made her emotional struggles even more severe. As Vanessa entered her teenage years, her anger and frustration at her situation began to manifest in dangerous ways. She struggled with substance abuse, engaged in self-harm, including cutting and suicide attempts, and clashed frequently with her grandmother, who was trying desperately to help her. The combination of brain injury, childhood trauma, and social rejection created a perfect storm of psychological problems that would plague Vanessa throughout her adolescence and into adulthood. She was diagnosed with multiple conditions, including bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Despite her grandmother's love and support, Vanessa felt disconnected from her family history and struggled with questions about her identity. She had no memory of her parents or sister, no sense of what her life might have been like if the attack had never occurred. The Bennett family murders had lasting effects on the Denver metropolitan area that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Parents throughout the region remained more vigilant about home security, and the random nature of the attacks created a lingering sense of vulnerability that lasted for years. The case became a symbol of how evil can strike anywhere, anytime, regardless of how careful or innocent the victims might be. It challenged people's fundamental beliefs about safety and security in their own homes and communities. Law enforcement agencies used the Bennett case as an example of why evidence preservation and thorough investigation techniques were so important. Even when cases couldn't be solved immediately, the careful collection and storage of evidence might prove crucial years or decades later when technology improved. The case also highlighted the need for better support systems for crime victims and their families. Connie and Vanessa Bennett struggled for years with insufficient resources to address the long-term consequences of the trauma they had experienced. Mental health professionals throughout the area noted increased anxiety and hypervigilance among their patients in the months and years following the murders. The psychological impact of knowing that such violence could happen randomly created lasting changes in how people viewed their personal safety. Throughout the 1,990 seconds and 2,000 seconds, forensic DNA technology continued to improve dramatically. What had been impossible in 1984 became routine investigative procedure. Cold cases throughout the country were being solved as investigators applied new techniques to old evidence. In 2001, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation was able to establish a DNA profile from biological materials collected at the Bennett crime scene. Semen found on carpet beneath Melissa's body and on a comforter from her bed provided clear genetic evidence that could potentially identify the killer. However, having a DNA profile was only half the battle. Investigators needed a suspect's DNA to compare it against. And without knowing who had committed the crimes, they had no way to obtain comparison samples. The profile was entered into national databases, but no immediate matches were found. For years, the DNA profile sat in databases, waiting for the right comparison sample to appear. Investigators periodically checked for updates, hoping that advances in technology or new entries into the system might finally provide the answer they had been seeking for decades. The breakthrough they needed would come from an unexpected source, a change in Nevada state law that would bring them face to face with their killer after 34 years of searching. In 2013, Nevada enacted legislation requiring mandatory DNA collection from individuals convicted of certain crimes. This seemingly routine change in state law would prove to be the key that unlocked one of Colorado's most notorious cold cases. Alex Christopher Ewing had been serving a 110-year sentence in Nevada since 1984 for a brutal attack on a couple in Henderson. He had been convicted of attempting to murder Christopher and Nancy Berry by beating them with an axe handle in their own home, while their young children slept in other rooms. When Nevada authorities collected Ewing's DNA sample in accordance with the new law, they uploaded it to the FBI's national database, known as CODIS, Combined DNA Index System. This routine procedure would finally provide the evidence that Colorado investigators had been waiting for since 1984. On the 17th of July 2018, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation received notification of a DNA match that would change everything. The genetic material found at the Bennett crime scene was a perfect match for Alex Christopher Ewing, a 57-year-old man who had been in prison for over 3 decades. When investigators first saw Ewing's photograph and criminal history, pieces of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for 34 years suddenly began falling into place. Ewing's age, physical characteristics, and history of violent crime matched the profile they had developed years earlier. Most importantly, Ewing's timeline matched perfectly with the Colorado attacks. He had been arrested in Nevada on the 11th of August 1984, just days after the Bennett murders. This meant he had been available to commit the Colorado crimes, but was immediately taken into custody afterward. The DNA match was extraordinarily strong. Experts testified that the probability of the genetic material belonging to anyone other than Ewing was 1-13 nonillion. That's 13 with 30 zeros after it. There was no reasonable doubt about the scientific evidence linking Ewing to the Bennett murders. When confronted with news of the DNA match while in his Nevada prison cell, Ewing's reaction was telling. According to investigators, he appeared shocked and immediately claimed there must be some mistake. He offered no explanation for how his DNA could have been found at the crime scene and quickly asked to speak with an attorney. Connecting additional cases. The DNA breakthrough in the Bennett case also provided answers to other unsolved crimes from the same time period. Ewing's genetic material was also found at the scene of Patricia Smith's murder in Lakewood, confirming that the same individual had committed both attacks. Investigators were able to connect Ewing to additional non-fatal attacks in the Denver area during January 1984, establishing a clear pattern of escalating violence that culminated in the Bennett family murders. The Haubenchild attack, the assault on Donna Holm, and several other incidents were all linked to the same perpetrator. Further investigation revealed Ewing's activities immediately after the Colorado attacks. He had fled to Arizona, where he attempted to kill Roy Williams by throwing a 20-pound rock at him while he slept. Ewing was arrested for this crime but escaped from custody during a gas station stop. The same night he escaped, Ewing broke into the Henderson, Nevada home of Christopher and Nancy Berry. He attacked the couple with an axe handle, while their young children slept in nearby rooms. Nancy Berry was forced to play dead to get Ewing to stop beating her, demonstrating the same extreme violence he had shown in Colorado. These attacks established Ewing as a serial killer whose violence knew no bounds. He was willing to attack anyone, men, women, children, elderly victims, with whatever weapon was available. The only common thread was his appetite for causing pain and suffering. When authorities moved to arrest Ewing on the Colorado charges in 2018, he was still serving his sentence in Nevada. The legal process of extraditing him to face trial for the Bennett murders proved complicated and time-consuming. Ewing's defense team fought the extradition, arguing that too much time had passed and that a fair trial would be impossible after so many years. They claimed that witnesses had died, memories had faded, and evidence might have deteriorated to the point where their client couldn't receive adequate legal representation. These arguments were ultimately rejected by the Nevada Supreme Court in February 2020. The court ruled that the strength of the DNA evidence and the serious nature of the charges warranted bringing Ewing to trial, regardless of the time that had passed. In March 2020, Ewing was finally transported to Colorado to face justice for crimes he had committed 36 years earlier. The extradition process had taken nearly 2 years, but investigators and prosecutors were determined to see this case through to completion. The COVID-19 pandemic created additional delays as court systems throughout the country struggled to conduct trials safely. However, both the prosecution and defense teams remained committed to moving forward with the case that had waited so long for resolution. The trial's most emotional moment came when 87-year-old Connie Bennett took the witness stand to describe the morning she discovered her murdered family. Despite her advanced age and the trauma she had endured, Connie's testimony was clear, powerful, and heartbreaking. She described arriving at her son's house after Bruce and Deborah failed to show up at work, her growing sense of dread as she approached the home, and the unimaginable horror of finding her family members brutally murdered. Her voice broke as she described finding 3-year-old Vanessa barely alive among the carnage. Connie's testimony provided crucial context about the family's normal routines and habits, helping to establish that the open garage door was unusual and that no family member or friend could have been responsible for the blood-stained footprints found throughout the house. The elderly woman's dignity and strength in the face of such overwhelming tragedy moved everyone in the courtroom. Her testimony made it clear that this wasn't just a legal proceeding about DNA evidence and forensic analysis, FOA. It was about real people whose lives had been destroyed by senseless violence. Under cross-examination, Connie remained composed and consistent in her recollections. The defense team treated her with respect, recognizing that attacking the credibility of such a sympathetic witness would likely backfire with the jury. Vanessa Bennett's testimony was one of the most anticipated moments of the trial. Now 40 years old, she took the witness stand to speak about the attack that had claimed her family and left her with lifelong disabilities and trauma. Vanessa testified that she had no memory of her parents, her sister, or the attack itself. Her earliest memories were of waking up in a hospital, confused and in pain, with no understanding of what had happened to her family. She described the extensive medical treatment she had required and the permanent injuries she continued to live with. She spoke about the metal plate in her forehead, the lasting effects of her brain injury, and the physical disabilities that made simple tasks difficult. Vanessa also testified about the emotional and psychological trauma that had affected every aspect of her life, the PTSD, bipolar disorder, and substance abuse issues that stemmed from that terrible night in 1984. Perhaps most powerfully, Vanessa described what it was like to grow up as the sole survivor of such a notorious crime. She talked about being mocked by other children who called her parents' killer the Hammerman and threatened that he would come for her friends if they visited her house. Her testimony demonstrated the lifelong consequences of Ewing's violence. This wasn't just about the 3 people he had killed, it was about the destruction of an entire family and the permanent damage inflicted on a 3-year-old child who had done nothing wrong. On Friday, the 6th of August 2021, after additional deliberation, the jury finally reached their verdict. The courtroom was packed with family members, investigators, and community members who had waited 37 years for this moment. Alex Christopher Ewing was found guilty on all 6 counts related to the murders of Bruce Bennett, Deborah Bennett, and 7-year-old Melissa Bennett. The charges included first-degree murder, felony murder, attempted murder of Vanessa Bennett, sexual assault on a child, and burglary. The reading of the verdict was an emotional moment for everyone present. Connie Bennett, who had discovered her murdered family all those years ago, wept as she heard the words that confirmed her family's killer would finally be held accountable. Vanessa Bennett, who had survived the attack as a 3-year-old and lived with its consequences for nearly 4 decades, felt a mixture of relief and continued grief. Justice had finally been served, but it could never bring back her parents and sister or undo the trauma she had endured. The prosecutors, who had worked tirelessly to build their case, felt vindicated in their efforts to seek justice for the Bennett family. The guilty verdict confirmed that their scientific evidence and legal arguments had been compelling enough to convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. Moving on, we have the Griquastad farm murders, a family's most horrific betrayal. On Good Friday evening, the 6th of April 2012, a teenage boy burst through the doors of the Griquastad police station, covered in blood and screaming in terror. "You must come. They've been shot. They are all dead," he cried, dropping to his knees before the shocked officers. This was Don Steenkamp, a fresh-faced 5-year-old with braces on his teeth and tousled brown hair, reporting the brutal murder of his entire family. What seemed like another tragic farm attack would soon reveal itself as something far more sinister, a betrayal so shocking that it would divide a nation and shake South Africa to its core. The small northern Cape town of Griquastad was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. This sleepy farming community of just a few thousand souls was built around agriculture, with families who had worked the harsh but fertile land for generations. Among these established farming families, the Steenkamps held a respected place in the community. Dion Steenkamp, 44, was a hard-working farmer who had built a successful operation on the family farm called Nauhoek, located about 10 kilometers south of Griquastad town center. He was known throughout the area as a fair employer and a man of his word. Like many farmers in the region, Dion had to balance the challenges of working the land with the ever-present security concerns that plagued South African agriculture. The farm itself was a testament to Dion's dedication and business sense. Nauhoek was well-maintained and profitable, supporting not only the Steenkamp family, but also providing employment for several local workers. The farmhouse, while modest by some standards, was comfortable and filled with the warmth of family life. Christelle Steenkamp, 43, was the kind of wife and mother who made a house feel like a home. She was deeply involved in the daily operations of the farm and was known for her kindness to the workers and their families. Christelle had that special quality that many farm wives possess, the ability to manage a household, support her husband's business, and still find time to nurture her children's dreams and ambitions. She was active in the local community and church, always willing to lend a helping hand when neighbors needed support. Christelle believed in the importance of education and was determined that her children would have every opportunity to succeed in life, whether they chose to continue the family farming tradition or pursue other paths. Those who knew Christelle described her as having a gentle spirit but also the inner strength necessary for life on a remote farm. She understood the risks that came with their lifestyle but believed that the rewards of raising a family in the close-knit farming community far outweighed the dangers. Marthella, a bright future ahead. 14-year-old Marthella Steenkamp was a typical teenager in many ways, full of life, curious about the world, and beginning to develop her own identity separate from her family. She was a good student who took her education seriously, understanding that knowledge would be key to whatever future she chose to pursue. Marthella had the kind of personality that drew people to her. She was friendly and outgoing, but also possessed the maturity that often comes from growing up in a rural environment where children learn responsibility at an early age. She helped around the farm when needed and was particularly good with the younger children of the farm workers. Like many teenage girls, Marthella was beginning to think about her future, whether she would go to university, what career she might pursue, and what kind of life she wanted to build for herself. She had dreams and ambitions that extended beyond the boundaries of Griquastad, but she also appreciated the values and sense of community that her rural upbringing had given her. The relationship between Marthella and her older brother Don seemed typical of most siblings, sometimes close, sometimes competitive, but generally characterized by the natural bond that exists between family members. She looked up to Don in many ways, proud of his achievements in school and sports. 15-year-old Don Steenkamp appeared to be everything parents could hope for in a son. He was academically gifted, attending the prestigious Grey College in Bloemfontein, one of South Africa's most respected educational institutions. His academic achievements were matched by his athletic prowess, as a national champion in tent pegging, an equestrian sport that required exceptional skill and dedication. Don was also actively involved in his local church and was known as a polite, well-mannered young man who showed proper respect for his elders and authority figures. His teachers and coaches spoke highly of his discipline and work ethic, qualities that seemed to predict a bright future ahead of him. Physically, Don looked exactly like what he was, a privileged teenager from a good family. He still wore braces on his teeth, had the kind of haircut favored by boys from elite schools, and carried himself with the quiet confidence that comes from success in academics and athletics. To the outside world, Don appeared to embody the values that his parents had worked so hard to instill in him. He was respectful, hardworking, talented, and seemed destined for great things. The contrast between this public image and what would later be revealed made the eventual truth all the more shocking. The Steenkamp family was part of a larger community of farming families who had built their lives around agriculture in this challenging but rewarding region. These families understood the risks that came with their lifestyle. 2012, the ever-present threat of farm attacks had created a sense of mutual dependence and support among neighbors. Farm attacks had become an unfortunate reality of South African agricultural life, with families often targeted for their isolation, the presence of firearms on their properties, and the belief that farmers kept large amounts of cash on hand. The Steenkamp family, like their neighbors, had taken reasonable precautions while trying not to live in constant fear. The community was tight-knit in the way that rural communities often are. People helped each other during difficult times, celebrated each other's successes, and provided support when tragedy struck. This interconnectedness would make the events of the 6th of April 2012 all the more traumatic for everyone involved. In the months leading up to the tragedy, the Steenkamp family appeared to be thriving. Don was excelling at Grey College, maintaining his academic achievements while continuing to compete successfully in tent pegging. His parents were proud of their son's accomplishments and looked forward to his bright future. The family participated regularly in church activities and maintained their reputation as upstanding members of the Griquastad community. Dion's farming operation was successful, providing financial stability and security for the family. From all outward appearances, the Steenkamps had achieved the South African dream of prosperity, security, and family harmony. However, beneath this perfect facade, darker currents were beginning to flow. Don had begun to express frustration about his future, particularly regarding his father's expectations that he complete his education before returning to farm. In conversations with Pastor Otto in November 2011, Don had stated that he only wanted to farm and nothing else, but his father insisted that he equip himself academically first. This conflict between father and son over Don's future may have seemed minor to outside observers, but it represented a deeper tension within the family about expectations, independence, and the path forward for the next generation. Like many farming families, the Steenkamps faced the constant financial pressures that come with agricultural life. The costs of maintaining a farm operation, sending children to expensive private schools, and providing for a comfortable lifestyle created ongoing stress that affected family relationships. Don was apparently aware of the family's financial situation and had shown some interest in the inheritance arrangements that had been made for him and his sister. This awareness of financial matters was unusual for a teenager, but not uncommon among children from farming families who understood that their future security was tied to the success of the family operation. The relationship between Don and his parents appeared to be complicated by expectations and pressures that may not have been fully understood by other family members. Don was expected to excel academically, athletically, and socially, while also preparing to eventually take over the family farming operation, ROA. A set of expectations that would challenge any teenager. The hidden darkness. What no one in the community knew was that a far more sinister dynamic was developing within the Steenkamp household. The prosecution would later argue that Don had been sexually abusing his younger sister Marthella, and that this abuse had been ongoing for some time. The isolation of farm life, combined with the authority structure within the family, may have created conditions that allowed this abuse to continue without detection. Marthella, like many victims of family sexual abuse, may have felt trapped by her circumstances and unable to seek help or report what was happening to her. The prosecution's case would later suggest that Marthella had either threatened to reveal the abuse or had actually told her parents about what Don was doing to her. This revelation, they argued, created the motive for the terrible events that would follow. The family's reputation in the community and Don's status as the golden boy would have made any allegations of sexual abuse particularly difficult to handle. For a family that prided itself on respectability and moral standing, such a scandal would have been devastating to their social position and Don's future prospects. Good Friday, the 6th of April 2012, began like any other day on the Steenkamp farm. The family went about their normal routines, with Dion attending to farm business and Crystal managing household affairs. Don was home from Grey College for the Easter holidays, spending time with his family and helping around the farm. The extended family had planned to gather for the traditional Easter celebrations, which would have brought together relatives and friends for food, fellowship, and the observance of this important Christian holiday. For a religious family like the Steenkamps, Easter held special significance and was typically a time of joy and togetherness. As the day progressed, the normal rhythm of farm life continued. Workers went about their duties, the family prepared for the evening's activities, and there was nothing to suggest that this would be anything other than a peaceful holiday weekend. However, behind the scenes, a deadly confrontation was building. According to the prosecution's later case, the situation between Don and Marthella had reached a crisis point, and Don had made the decision to eliminate the witnesses to his crimes rather than face the consequences of his actions. The exact sequence of events that led to the deaths of Deon, Christel, and Marthella Steenkamp may never be fully known, but the physical evidence would later paint a chilling picture of calculated violence. The murders were committed using the family's own firearms, FO, a .357 Magnum revolver, and a .22 caliber gun, weapons that Don would have known how to use from his life on the farm. Deon Steenkamp, the family patriarch, was shot multiple times in what appeared to be a violent struggle. The evidence suggested that he had fought for his life, possibly trying to protect his wife and daughter from an attacker he may not have immediately recognized as his own son. Christel Steenkamp was also shot multiple times, her body found in the farmhouse, with injuries that indicated she had been brutally murdered. The woman who had dedicated her life to nurturing her family had died in an act of unimaginable betrayal by the son she had loved and supported. The murder of 14-year-old Marthella was particularly horrific. The evidence would later show that she had been raped in the 24 hours before her death, and that she had engaged in a struggle with her attacker before being shot and killed. The physical evidence suggested that Marthella had fought for her life, leaving behind traces that would later help convict her killer. The prosecution would argue that this was not a crime of passion, but a calculated plan to eliminate the witnesses to Don's ongoing sexual abuse of his sister. The choice of weapons, the timing of the attacks, and the subsequent actions all pointed to premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of violence. What happened next would demonstrate the calculating nature of the crime. Don Steenkamp carefully created the scene that he would present to authorities, that of a farm attack survivor who had witnessed the murder of his family by unknown attackers. He inflicted injuries on himself to support his story, creating scratch marks on his neck and ensuring that his hands and clothing were covered with blood. These injuries were designed to suggest that he had been in a struggle with the attackers or had been injured while trying to help his dying family members. Don then drove his father's Isuzu Baki to the Griquastad police station, arriving just before 7 p.m. with what appeared to be devastating news. His performance was convincing. He was emotional, covered in blood, and appeared to be genuinely traumatized by what he claimed to have witnessed. The weapons used in the murders were placed at the farm gate, positioned to support Don's story that the attackers had discarded them while fleeing the scene. This detail was designed to explain how he had come to possess the murder weapons and why he was turning them over to police. When Don Steenkamp burst into the Griquastad police station that Friday evening, the officers on duty were immediately concerned about what appeared to be another farm attack. The young man was clearly distressed, covered in blood, and reporting the deaths of his entire family. The police officers, including Warrant Officer Wild, who was in charge of the station, noted that Don was very emotional and that his face and hands were bloodied with fresh scratch marks on his neck. His story was coherent despite his apparent distress. He claimed to have hidden in the farm barn during the attack and returned to the house only after the shooting stopped. According to Don's initial account, he had found his sister Marthella still alive when he returned to the house. He claimed that she died in his arms, which explained the blood on his clothing. This detail was particularly poignant and added credibility to his role as a traumatized survivor rather than a perpetrator. The police immediately began treating the case as a farm attack, which was a reasonable assumption given the location, the nature of the crimes, and the prevalence of such attacks in rural South Africa. They secured the crime scene and began the process of investigating what appeared to be a tragic but familiar type of violent crime. When investigators arrived at the Naohook farm, they found a scene of brutal violence that initially seemed consistent with a typical farm attack. 3 family members had been shot and killed using firearms, and the house showed signs of the struggle that had taken place. However, experienced investigators began to notice details that didn't quite fit the typical pattern of farm attacks. The positioning of the bodies, the nature of the injuries, and certain aspects of the crime scene suggested that this might not be a straightforward case of strangers attacking an isolated farm family. The forensic investigation was extensive and professional, with experts carefully documenting every aspect of the scene. Blood spatter evidence, bullet trajectories, and the positioning of the bodies all provided clues about what had actually happened during the attacks. Of particular significance was the evidence related to Marthella's death. The forensic examination revealed that she had been sexually assaulted before being killed, and that there were signs of a struggle that were inconsistent with Don's account of events. The blood evidence also suggested that Marthella's injuries occurred before she entered the house, contradicting Don's claim that she died in his arms inside the farmhouse. News of the Steenkamp family murders sent shockwaves through the Griquastad community and beyond. Farm attacks were unfortunately common in South Africa, but the brutality of this particular incident and the fact that it involved a well-respected local family made it especially traumatic for the tight-knit community. The fact that young Don Steenkamp was the sole survivor initially generated sympathy and support from neighbors and friends. People reached out to offer help and comfort to the traumatized teenager who had lost his entire family in such a horrible way. Church members, fellow farmers, and family friends all expressed their concern for Don's welfare and their determination to support him through this difficult time. The community's response was typical of rural South African communities when tragedy strikes. People came together to provide practical and emotional support. However, as details of the investigation began to emerge, the community would become increasingly divided about what had really happened on the Steenkamp farm that Good Friday evening. As investigators continued their work, they began to identify inconsistencies in Don's account of events that raised questions about his credibility as a witness. The timeline he provided didn't match the physical evidence, and certain details of his story couldn't be corroborated by the crime scene investigation. One significant issue was the ballistics evidence. Both weapons that Don had turned over to police were confirmed to have been used in the murders. This created problems for Don's story, as he claimed to have found the discarded weapons after the attackers had fled. The ballistics evidence suggested that it would have been impossible for him to have heard additional shots after he drove away, as he claimed. The blood spatter analysis also raised questions about Don's account. Experts testified that the blood patterns on his clothing and the crime scene were not consistent with his claim that Marthella had torn his shirt while dying in his arms. The evidence suggested instead that Marthella would have been too weak to tear his shirt in her final moments. Additionally, investigators found that Don's story about warning the farm workers was inconsistent with their testimony. The workers reported that Don had driven up to the farm gate, opened it, and only then told them to leave because his family had been killed. This suggested that he had not taken the route he claimed to have taken to warn them. As the investigation continued and the evidence mounted, authorities made the decision to arrest Don Steenkamp for the murders of his family members. On the 21st of August 2012, more than 4 months after the murders, Don was arrested at his school, Grey College in Bloemfontein. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Griquastad community and throughout South Africa. The idea that a 15-year-old boy could have murdered his entire family was almost incomprehensible to many people, and the case immediately became a national sensation. The charges against Don were severe: 3 counts of murder for the deaths of his parents and sister, rape charges related to the sexual assault of Marthella, and charges of defeating the ends of justice for lying to police about what had happened. The arrest divided the Griquastad community, with some residents convinced of Don's guilt based on the evidence, while others maintained their belief in his innocence. This division would persist throughout the legal proceedings that followed. Don Steenkamp's trial began in late 2013 and was conducted in the Northern Cape High Court in Kimberley under Judge-President Frans K. Gomo. Due to Don's age at the time of the crimes, the proceedings were conducted under special rules governing juvenile cases, with restrictions on media coverage and public identification. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Hannes Cloet, presented a comprehensive case based on forensic evidence, ballistics analysis, and expert testimony about the crime scene. Their theory was that Don had been sexually abusing his sister Marthella, that she had threatened to reveal or had revealed this abuse, and that he had murdered the entire family to cover up his crimes. The defense team, initially led by advocate Willem Coetzee, faced the difficult task of defending against overwhelming physical evidence while maintaining their client's innocence. They attempted to raise questions about the forensic evidence and suggest alternative explanations for the inconsistencies in Don's account. The prosecution presented extensive evidence to support their case against Don Steenkamp. This included ballistics evidence. Both weapons used in the murders were the family's own firearms, which Don had turned over to police. Expert testimony established that these were the only weapons used in the crimes, contradicting Don's story about finding them discarded by fleeing attackers. Blood spatter analysis. Forensic experts testified that the blood patterns found on Don's clothing and at the crime scene were inconsistent with his account of events. The evidence suggested that he had been involved in a violent struggle rather than simply finding and comforting dying family members. Medical evidence. The autopsy results showed that Marthella had been sexually assaulted before her death, and that there were signs this may not have been the first time she had been abused. The prosecution argued that Don was responsible for this ongoing abuse. Timeline inconsistencies. Investigators were able to establish a timeline using GPS data and other evidence that contradicted key aspects of Don's story about his movements on the day of the murders. Behavioral evidence. Testimony revealed that Don had asked about his inheritance just 2 days after the murders, suggesting a financial motive for the crimes and premeditation rather than a spontaneous reaction to trauma. The defense strategy. The defense faced enormous challenges in representing Don Steenkamp. The physical evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution had presented a coherent theory of the crimes that explained both the murders and the apparent motive behind them. The defense initially attempted to maintain Don's innocence while questioning the reliability and interpretation of the forensic evidence. They suggested that the investigation might have been flawed, or that the evidence could support alternative explanations for what had happened. However, the case took a dramatic turn when Don dismissed his legal team shortly before judgment was expected to be delivered. He claimed there were insurmountable differences with his attorneys, leading to delays in the proceedings and the appointment of new counsel. This decision by Don to change legal representation at such a critical moment raised questions about his mental state and his satisfaction with how his defense was being conducted. It also prolonged the legal proceedings and added to the drama surrounding the case. On the 27th of March 2014, Judge President Franz Kagomo delivered his verdict in the Griquastad murders case. After carefully considering all the evidence presented during the lengthy trial, he found Don Steenkamp guilty on all charges. The judge convicted Don of 3 counts of murder for the deaths of Dion, Christelle, and Marthella Steenkamp, rape for the sexual assault of Marthella, defeating the ends of justice for lying to police about the crimes. In delivering his judgment, Judge Kagomo made it clear that he was convinced not only that Don was responsible for raping Marthella in the 24 hours before her death, but that this was likely not the first time she had been sexually abused by her brother. The judge agreed with the prosecution's theory that the motive for the triple murder was Don's desire to prevent the truth about his sexual abuse of Marthella from coming to light. The systematic nature of the murders and the attempt to cover them up with an elaborate deception demonstrated the calculating nature of the crimes. On Don Steenkamp's 18th birthday, 29th of March 2014, Judge Kagomo sentenced him for the crimes that had shocked South Africa. The sentences were 20 years imprisonment for each of the 3 murder counts, 12 years for the rape conviction, 4 years for defeating the ends of justice. However, all sentences were to run concurrently, meaning that Don would effectively serve 20 years in prison. Due to South African law regarding juvenile offenders, this was the maximum sentence that could be imposed on someone who was under 16 at the time of committing the crimes. During the sentencing hearing, Judge Kagomo addressed Don directly, telling him to face the consequences of his actions. "In 2 days you are a man. Now, be a man." The judge's words emphasized the gravity of the crimes and the need for Don to accept responsibility for his actions. The Griquastad farm murders case stands as one of the most shocking family crimes in South African history. What began as an apparent farm attack, a tragedy that would have been horrible enough, revealed itself to be something far more disturbing: the calculated murder of an entire family by their own son and brother. Don Steenkamp's crimes shattered fundamental assumptions about family loyalty, the innocence of youth, and the safety of home. His ability to maintain a facade of respectability while committing ongoing sexual abuse, and then to murder 3 people to cover up his crimes, demonstrated a level of calculation and coldness that was difficult for many people to comprehend. The case highlighted several important issues within South African society. It showed how sexual abuse within families could remain hidden for extended periods, protected by authority structures and social expectations. It also demonstrated the pressure placed on young people to achieve perfection in multiple areas of their lives, and the potential consequences when that pressure becomes unbearable. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the case revealed how effectively someone could manipulate public sympathy and maintain a convincing performance even after committing the most heinous crimes. Don's initial presentation as a traumatized survivor was so convincing that it took months of careful investigation to reveal the truth. The forensic evidence that ultimately convicted Don Steenkamp also demonstrated the importance of professional crime scene investigation and expert analysis. Without the careful work of ballistics experts, blood spatter analysts, and other forensic specialists, this case might never have been solved, and a calculated killer might have escaped justice. For the victims, Dion, Christelle, and Marthella Steenkamp, T.O., justice came through the conviction of their killer, but at a terrible cost. 3 lives were lost, a family was destroyed, and a community was forever changed by the actions of someone who should have been their protector rather than their destroyer. The Griquastad murders serve as a reminder that evil can exist in the most unexpected places, and that the people we trust most can sometimes pose the greatest danger. They also demonstrate the importance of believing victims of sexual abuse and providing them with safe ways to report crimes committed by family members. Today, Don Steenkamp remains in prison, serving his sentence for crimes that shocked a nation. The case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and legal experts, trying to understand how such extreme violence could occur within a family setting. The small town of Griquastad has moved forward, but the shadow of these murders continues to influence how residents think about safety, trust, and the hidden dynamics that can exist within seemingly perfect families. The case serves as a permanent reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that the most dangerous predators are sometimes those who are closest to us. And finally, we come to what is arguably the darkest of them all, the Wells Gray Park murders, where a family camping trip ended in a brutal massacre. The 2nd of August 1982 was supposed to be the beginning of the perfect family vacation. 3 generations of one loving family, grandparents, parents, and 2 young daughters, set out for a 2-week camping adventure in the beautiful wilderness of British Columbia. They packed their vehicles with camping gear, loaded a boat on top of their camper, and headed toward Wells Gray Provincial Park with hearts full of excitement and anticipation. None of them could have imagined that they were driving toward their deaths, stalked by a predator who would turn their dream vacation into Canada's most horrific family massacre. Bob Johnson was the kind of man who embodied the values of hard work and family dedication. At 44 years old, he had spent 25 years working at Gorman Brothers Lumber in Westbank, British Columbia, building a reputation as one of the most reliable employees the company had ever had. In a quarter-century of employment, Bob had never missed a single day of work, a testament to his character and commitment to providing for his family. Bob was married to Jackie, a vibrant 41-year-old woman who shared his love of the outdoors and family adventures. Together, they had created a warm, loving home that centered around their 2 daughters, who were the light of their lives. The Johnson family represented the best of Canadian family values, tenling. They worked hard, loved deeply, and believed in spending quality time together, creating memories that would last a lifetime. The couple lived in Kelowna, in the interior of British Columbia, where they had built a comfortable life, surrounded by the natural beauty that drew so many people to the region. Bob's steady employment and Jackie's dedication to their home created a stable foundation for their growing daughters, and they looked forward to many more years of family adventures together. 13-year-old Janet Johnson was blossoming into a beautiful young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was at that wonderful age where childhood wonder was beginning to give way to teenage curiosity about the wider world. Janet loved spending time outdoors with her family, and she had inherited her parents' appreciation for the natural beauty of British Columbia. Janet was responsible and mature for her age, often helping to look after her younger sister during family outings. She had dreams and aspirations that her parents encouraged, and she was excited about the adventures that lay ahead as she moved through her teenage years toward adulthood. 11-year-old Karen Johnson was still very much a child, full of energy and enthusiasm for every new experience. She adored her older sister Janet and looked up to her in all things. Karen brought laughter and joy wherever she went, with the kind of infectious happiness that only children possess. Karen loved camping trips with her family because they meant uninterrupted time with the people she loved most. She enjoyed roasting marshmallows over the campfire, exploring the woods around their campsites, and listening to her parents and grandparents tell stories under the stars. Her innocence and trust in the world around her made her especially vulnerable to the evil that would soon enter their lives. George Bentley, 66, and his wife Edith, 59, were the kind of grandparents who brought families together and created lasting traditions. They lived in Port Coquitlam, a city in Metro Vancouver, but distance never prevented them from being actively involved in their granddaughters' lives. George had worked hard throughout his life to provide for his family and was now enjoying his retirement years by spending precious time with his children and grandchildren. He understood the importance of family connections and was always eager to participate in activities that brought multiple generations together. Edith Bentley was a loving grandmother who doted on Janet and Karen, always ready with hugs, homemade treats, and the kind of unconditional love that grandmothers are famous for providing. She was the glue that held the extended family together, organizing gatherings and making sure that everyone stayed connected despite the busy pace of modern life. The Bentleys had invested in a camper truck and boat, specifically so they could take extended camping trips with their family. They believed strongly in the importance of creating shared experiences and memories, and they were always looking for new adventures they could enjoy together. Planning the perfect vacation. The August 1982 camping trip had been planned for months, with everyone eagerly anticipating 2 weeks of relaxation and adventure in one of British Columbia's most beautiful wilderness areas. Wells Gray Provincial Park, located about 120 kilometers north of Kamloops, was the perfect destination for a family that loved the outdoors. The park covers over 5,000 square kilometers and contains 39 different waterfalls, dramatic mountain peaks, wildflower meadows, and more than 200 kilometers of hiking trails. It was exactly the kind of place where a family could disconnect from the pressures of daily life and reconnect with each other and with nature. The plan was for Bob and Jackie Johnson to drive up from Kelowna with their daughters, while George and Edith Bentley would drive up from Port Coquitlam in their camper truck with a boat loaded on top. They would meet at a campsite and spend 2 glorious weeks exploring the wilderness, fishing, hiking, and enjoying the kind of quality family time that busy work and school schedules often made difficult. Everyone was excited about the trip. The girls had been counting down the days, their parents were looking forward to a break from their routines, and the grandparents were thrilled at the prospect of spending extended time with their beloved granddaughters. It was going to be the vacation of a lifetime. While the Johnson and Bentley families were excitedly preparing for their camping adventure, a dangerous predator was already living in the Clearwater area where they planned to vacation. David William Shearing, born in 1959, was a 23-year-old local man with a dark secret that no one in his community suspected. On the surface, Shearing appeared to be a fairly normal young man from a respectable family. His father had once worked as a prison guard, and his brother was a sheriff, occupations that suggested a family committed to law and order. Shearing himself had graduated from high school and completed a heavy mechanic course, giving him the skills needed for steady employment in the resource-based economy of rural British Columbia. However, beneath this facade of normalcy lay a disturbed individual with violent sexual fantasies that had been developing since his mid-teens. Shearing later admitted that he had harbored thoughts of rape and murder for years, and that he had already escalated to actual violence by killing a teenager before the camping trip massacre, crime that had gone undetected and gave him confidence to escalate further. The isolation of the Clearwater area, with its maze of logging roads and remote wilderness areas, provided the perfect hunting ground for someone with Shearing's twisted inclinations. He knew the area intimately and understood that he could commit crimes in locations where bodies might never be found and where he could easily escape detection. When the Johnson and Bentley families arrived at their campsite near Bear Creek, they had no way of knowing that they were being watched by a predator who saw them as the perfect opportunity to fulfill his darkest fantasies. The campsite was located beside Phage Creek, 18 kilometers north of Clearwater and 18 kilometers south of the Wells Gray Park entrance on Clearwater Valley Road. The location was secluded and beautiful, exactly the kind of spot that families seek out for peaceful camping experiences. Unfortunately, this same isolation that made it perfect for a family vacation also made it perfect for someone with violent intentions. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and the thick forest provided excellent cover for someone who wanted to observe without being seen. Shearing later admitted that he had spotted the family several days before he decided to act. From his vantage point hidden in the woods, he stalked them like a hunter stalking prey, watching their daily routines and becoming particularly fixated on one 3-year-old Janet Johnson. He observed the family interactions and began developing a plan to attack them when they were most vulnerable. The fact that the family included 2 young girls was what drew Shearing's attention and sealed their fate. His sexual fantasies focused on young females, and the presence of Janet and Karen made this family irresistible to him. He spent days watching them, learning their habits, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. For several days, the Johnson and Bentley families enjoyed exactly the kind of vacation they had hoped for. They set up their camp in the beautiful wilderness setting, with the adults relaxing around the campfire, while the girls explored their surroundings and enjoyed the freedom that comes with outdoor adventures. The families were experienced campers who knew how to enjoy the wilderness safely. They followed proper food storage procedures, maintained a clean campsite, and took reasonable precautions for their security. However, they could not have anticipated the specific threat that was stalking them from the surrounding forest. During the day, they enjoyed hiking, fishing, and exploring the area around their campsite. The grandparents delighted in spending quality time with their granddaughters, while Bob and Jackie appreciated the chance to slow down and enjoy simple pleasures with their family. The boat that the Bentleys had brought provided opportunities for water activities, and everyone was having the kind of experiences that create lifelong memories. In the evenings, they gathered around their campfire for meals and conversation. The adults would sit and talk while the girls prepared to settle into their tent for the night. These peaceful evening hours, when families traditionally feel most safe and relaxed, would prove to be when they were most vulnerable to the predator who was watching from the darkness. On the 6th of August 1982, the family made their final contact with the outside world when Edith Bentley called her other daughter to check in and let the family know that everyone was having a wonderful time. This phone call represented the last time any of them would speak to relatives or friends, marking the end of their connection to the normal world they had temporarily left behind. The phone call was routine and cheerful, exactly the kind of update that families make during successful vacations. Edith reported that everyone was healthy and happy, that the weather was beautiful, and that they were enjoying every moment of their time together in the wilderness. There was no hint of danger or concern in her voice, no indication that anything was amiss. This final phone call would later become a crucial piece of evidence in establishing the timeline of when the family disappeared. It provided investigators with a definitive last known contact, after which the family seemed to vanish completely from the face of the earth. For the relatives who received that cheerful phone call, it would become a bittersweet memory. On the evening of the 10th of August 1982, David Shearing made his decision to act on the violent fantasies that had been consuming his thoughts for days. As darkness began to fall over the campsite, he armed himself with a .22 caliber Remington pump-action rifle and approached the unsuspecting family who were enjoying what they thought was another peaceful evening in the wilderness. The four adults, Bob and Jackie Johnson, and George and Edith Bentley, were sitting around their campfire, probably discussing the day's activities and planning for the adventures that lay ahead. The two girls, Janet and Karen, had gone into their tent to prepare for sleep, following the routine that had become comfortable and familiar during their days at the campsite. None of them saw Shearing emerge from the tree line like a shadow from a nightmare. He had positioned himself carefully, using his knowledge of the terrain and his experience stalking the family to approach from an angle where he could not be detected until it was too late for them to escape or defend themselves. The first gunshot shattered the peaceful evening and alerted the family to the mortal danger they were now facing. In that instant, their perfect vacation became a fight for survival against a predator who had already decided that none of them would be allowed to live. The attack on the four adults was swift and brutal. Shearing's first shots were aimed at the people sitting around the campfire, the parents and grandparents who represented the greatest potential threat to his plans. Using a .22 caliber weapon, he systematically shot each of the adults, ensuring that none of them could escape or call for help. George Bentley, the six-year-old grandfather who had worked his whole life to provide for his family, was gunned down while probably trying to protect his wife and daughter. His final moments were spent facing the kind of evil that most people never encounter, dying far from the comfortable retirement he had earned through decades of hard work. Edith Bentley, the loving grandmother who had been so excited about spending time with her granddaughters, was also shot and killed. The woman who had made that cheerful phone call just days earlier, reporting on the wonderful time the family was having, died in terror and confusion as her perfect vacation turned into a nightmare. Jackie Johnson, the devoted mother who had looked forward to this family bonding time, was murdered while probably trying to reach her daughters or understand what was happening to her family. Her death left two young girls without the protection of their mother at the moment when they needed her most. Bob Johnson, the reliable man who had never missed a day of work in 25 years, was shot and killed while likely trying to defend his family against an attacker whose motives were incomprehensible to normal people. His death meant that no one was left to protect his two daughters from whatever horrors lay ahead. Capture and abuse of the girls. With the four adults dead, Shearing turned his attention to the real objects of his obsession, one 3-year-old Janet and one 1-year-old Karen Johnson. The two girls, who had been in their tent when the shooting started, were now completely at the mercy of a sexual predator who had been fantasizing about this moment for days. Rather than killing the girls immediately, Shearing kept them alive for almost a week, during which time he repeatedly sexually assaulted them. The exact details of what those two innocent children endured during those days of captivity are too horrific to fully comprehend. But court documents and Shearing's later confessions make it clear that they suffered unimaginable torture and abuse. The girls were held in an isolated area where their screams could not be heard by anyone who might have helped them. They were completely powerless against their captor, who had demonstrated his willingness to kill by murdering their parents and grandparents before their eyes. During this period of captivity, the girls would have experienced terror beyond description, knowing that the man who had killed their family was now holding them prisoner for his own twisted purposes. They would have hoped and prayed for rescue that never came, and they would have clung to each other for whatever comfort was possible in their desperate situation. After days of keeping Janet and Karen alive for his sexual gratification, Shearing ultimately decided to eliminate the witnesses to his crimes. He took each girl separately into the woods, where he shot and killed them one at a time. This final act of violence completed the annihilation of an entire family and demonstrated the depths of Shearing's depravity. 13-year-old Janet, who had been on the verge of becoming a young woman with dreams and aspirations for her future, was murdered in cold blood by a man who saw her only as an object for his twisted desires. Her death represented not only the end of her young life, but the destruction of all the potential she had carried within her. 11-year-old Karen, who had trusted in the safety and security provided by her family, died at the hands of a monster who had shown her nothing but cruelty and violence. The little girl who had been roasting marshmallows and listening to family stories around the campfire just days earlier was murdered by someone who felt no empathy or remorse for his actions. With all 6 family members dead, Shearing had accomplished the complete destruction of 2 generations of one family. The grandparents who had worked hard to create a legacy for their children and grandchildren were gone. The parents who had dedicated their lives to providing for and protecting their daughters were gone. The children who represented the hope and future of the family were gone. After completing the murders, Shearing attempted to cover up his crimes by destroying the evidence and making the family's disappearance look like something other than what it actually was. He loaded all 6 bodies into the Johnson family's car, with the 4 adults placed in the back seat and the 2 girls' bodies put in the trunk. Shearing then drove the car to a remote location on Battle Mountain Road, about 13 aerial miles from Bear Creek and north of Clearwater. This area was accessible by logging road but far enough from civilization that the burned-out vehicle might not be discovered for a long time, if ever. Once he had positioned the car in the isolated location, Shearing poured gasoline over the vehicle and the bodies inside it, then set the entire thing on fire. The intense heat of the fire was designed to destroy any forensic evidence that might link him to the crimes, including fingerprints, DNA evidence, and ballistic evidence from the bullets. The burning car created a massive blaze that could be seen from a distance, but the remote location meant that no one was likely to investigate until long after the fire had burned itself out. Shearing believed that by the time the car was discovered, any evidence of his involvement would have been destroyed by the flames. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came on the 16th of August 1982, when Bob Johnson failed to return to work at Gorman Brothers Lumber in West Bank. For his co-workers, this was immediately alarming because Bob had never missed a day of work in his 25 years with the company. His perfect attendance record made his absence impossible to ignore or explain away. Bob's supervisor and fellow employees knew that he was supposed to return from his camping trip that day, and they had expected him to arrive at work as usual. When he failed to appear and didn't call to explain his absence, they realized that something must have happened to prevent him from returning as planned. The concern among Bob's co-workers grew throughout the day as attempts to contact him were unsuccessful. Phone calls to the Johnson family home went unanswered, and no one had heard from any member of the camping party since Edith Bentley's phone call on the 6th of August. By the end of the workday on the 16th of August, Bob's co-workers were convinced that the family was in serious trouble. They made the decision to contact the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, to report the missing family, officially beginning what would become one of the largest search operations in British Columbia history. On the 23rd of August, 1982, exactly 1 week after Bob Johnson failed to return to work, the RCMP formally launched their investigation into the disappearance of the Johnson and Bentley families. By this time, it had been 17 days since the last confirmed contact with any member of the family, making their disappearance a serious concern for law enforcement. The RCMP began by attempting to trace the family's intended route and destinations. They knew that the family had planned to camp in the Wells Gray Park area, so that became the initial focus of their search efforts. The vast wilderness of the park presented enormous challenges for searchers, with thousands of square kilometers of rugged terrain to cover. Investigators also began the process of interviewing anyone who might have had contact with the family or seen them during their camping trip. This included other campers, park employees, local residents, and anyone else who might have information about the family's whereabouts or activities. The investigation was complicated by the remote nature of the area and the limited number of witnesses who might have seen the family. The very isolation that had made the location attractive for camping also made it difficult for investigators to find people who had interacted with or observed the missing family. The massive search operation. The search for the Johnson and Bentley families became one of the largest search operations in British Columbia history, involving multiple agencies and hundreds of volunteers. The RCMP coordinated efforts that included local police departments, search and rescue teams, the Canadian military, and civilian volunteers from across the region. Search teams used helicopters and small aircraft equipped with infrared photography equipment that could detect recently overturned soil or other signs of disturbance on the ground. These aerial searches covered hundreds of square miles of wilderness, looking for any indication of where the family might have gone or what might have happened to them. Ground teams searched hiking trails, logging roads, and remote areas where the family might have camped or where their vehicles might have broken down. Searchers looked for any sign of the family's presence, tupi, abandoned campsites, discarded equipment, or any other evidence that might provide clues about their fate. The search operation also included specialized teams trained in water recovery, who searched lakes, rivers, and streams in the area where the family might have encountered difficulties. The possibility that they had suffered some kind of accident while engaging in water activities was considered a plausible explanation for their disappearance. On the 13th of September 1982, exactly 6 weeks after the family had last been heard from, a mushroom picker made a discovery that would transform the missing persons case into a murder investigation. While searching for mushrooms in a remote area near Battle Mountain Road, the individual found a burned-out car that matched the description of the vehicle the Johnson family had been driving. The car was located in a clearing off a mountainside logging road, positioned in such a way that it was partially hidden from view but still accessible by vehicle. The intense fire had gutted the interior of the car and left little but the metal frame and some charred debris. When RCMP officers arrived at the scene and began examining the burned vehicle, they made a horrific discovery. In the back seat of the car, they found a pile of burned bones that were later identified as the remains of 4 adults. In the trunk, they found the burned remains of 2 children. The discovery confirmed everyone's worst fears. The Johnson and Bentley families had not simply gotten lost or suffered an accident during their camping trip. They had been murdered, and their bodies had been burned in an attempt to destroy the evidence of the crimes committed against them. The forensic investigation of the burned car and the remains found inside it provided crucial evidence about what had happened to the family, despite the perpetrator's attempts to destroy all traces of his crimes. Even though the intense heat had damaged much of the physical evidence, skilled forensic investigators were able to extract important information. Ballistics experts were able to determine that the victims had been shot with a .22 caliber weapon, based on bullet fragments and other evidence recovered from the scene. This information helped establish that the deaths were homicides rather than accidents, and it provided investigators with details about the type of weapon used in the murders. The positioning of the bodies within the car also provided clues about how the crime had been committed. The fact that 4 adults were placed in the back seat, while the 2 children were placed in the trunk, suggested a deliberate arrangement by someone who was trying to conceal multiple bodies in a single vehicle. Forensic investigators also found evidence that gasoline had been used as an accelerant to ensure that the fire burned hot enough and long enough to destroy as much evidence as possible. This indicated premeditation and planning on the part of the killer, rather than a spontaneous attempt to cover up a crime of passion. With the discovery of the burned car and bodies, investigators now knew that they were dealing with a multiple homicide case. The next priority was to locate where the family had actually been camping when they were attacked, since this location would likely contain the most important evidence about how the crimes were committed. The car had been found about 13 aerial miles from Bear Creek, and investigators began focusing their search efforts in that general area. They were looking for a campsite that would show signs of the family's presence, as well as evidence of the violent attack that had occurred there. The search for the campsite was complicated by the vast area that needed to be covered, and the possibility that the killer had attempted to clean up or camouflage the crime scene. However, investigators were confident that a site where 6 people had been murdered would contain physical evidence that could not be completely eliminated. Eventually, searchers found the campsite near Bear Creek, where they discovered evidence that confirmed this was where the family had been staying and where the attack had occurred. The site contained personal belongings, camping equipment, and other items that belonged to the Johnson and Bentley families. The campsite near Bear Creek provided investigators with crucial evidence about how the murders had been committed and what had happened during the family's final days. The site showed signs of a normal family camping experience that had been violently interrupted by an armed attacker. Investigators found 6 spent .22 caliber ammunition shells at the campsite, confirming that this was where the shooting had occurred. The shells were located in positions that suggested the shooter had moved around the campsite during the attack, firing at different targets from various positions. Personal belongings of the family were scattered around the campsite, including some items that had apparently been taken from the family's vehicles. Beer bottles that Bob Johnson had been known to drink were found cooling in a nearby stream, indicating that the family had been engaged in normal camping activities right up until the time of the attack. Investigators also found evidence that someone had been at the campsite for an extended period, both before and after the murders. This included 2 sticks with sharp ends that had probably been used by Janet and Karen to roast marshmallows over the campfire. a poignant reminder of the innocent family activities that had been taking place just before the violence began. With the discovery of the bodies and the crime scene, the RCMP launched an intensive investigation into the murders of the Johnson and Bentley families. The case was assigned to experienced detectives who specialized in major crimes, and resources were devoted to solving what had become one of the most shocking mass murders in Canadian history. The investigation faced significant challenges from the beginning. The remote location of the crimes meant that there were very few potential witnesses who might have seen suspicious activity or individuals in the area. The killer's attempt to destroy evidence by burning the bodies had eliminated much of the physical evidence that might have provided clues about his identity. However, investigators were determined to solve the case and bring the killer to justice. They began by conducting extensive interviews with anyone who might have information about the family's activities or about suspicious individuals in the Clearwater area during the relevant time period. The investigation also included efforts to trace any stolen property that might have been taken from the family's campsite. The killer had looted the campsite and vehicles, and investigators hoped that some of these items might eventually surface in pawn shops, used goods stores, or other locations where stolen property typically appears. During the months following the discovery of the bodies, the investigation was hampered by numerous false leads and dead ends that consumed time and resources without bringing investigators any closer to solving the case. The high-profile nature of the murders generated hundreds of tips from the public, most of which proved to be unhelpful or inaccurate. One of the most significant false leads involved a theory that the family had been killed by unknown assailants who had fled the area in the Bentley family's camper truck. This theory led investigators to conduct an expensive and time-consuming search across Canada, driving a replica of the truck to Ontario and Quebec to follow up on reported sightings. Over 300 people claimed to have seen a vehicle matching the description of the Bentley camper truck heading east during the fall and winter following the murders. Each of these reports had to be investigated, requiring extensive travel and coordination between law enforcement agencies across the country. The cross-country search ultimately proved to be futile, consuming valuable resources, while the real killer remained free and undetected in the local area. The failure of this massive effort was later criticized as a costly mistake that diverted attention from more promising lines of investigation. More than a year after the murders, on the 18th of October 1983, two forestry workers made a discovery that would refocus the investigation on the local area. While working on Trophy Mountain, not far from Wellsgrey Provincial Park, they found the burned-out remains of a 1981 Ford camper truck that matched the description of the vehicle the Bentley family had been driving. The truck was located on an abandoned logging road in a remote area that would have been difficult to find without intimate knowledge of the local terrain. Like the Johnson family car, the truck had been burned in an attempt to destroy evidence, and it was clear that it had been hidden in a location where it might never have been discovered. The discovery of the truck so close to the murder scene effectively ended the theory that the killer had fled to eastern Canada. It now seemed obvious that the perpetrator was someone familiar with the local area, who knew about the maze of logging roads that crisscrossed the wilderness around Wellsgrey Park. The truck was airlifted out of the forest by helicopter and transported to the RCMP crime laboratory in Vancouver for forensic examination. Investigators hoped that despite the fire damage, they might find evidence that would help identify who had driven the truck to its final location and destroyed it. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source during the questioning of local residents after the truck was found. During routine interviews with people in the Clearwater area, one person mentioned that David Shearing had asked about how to re-register a Ford pickup truck and repair a hole in its door. This comment was significant because investigators had never publicly revealed that there was a bullet hole in the Bentley family truck. The fact that Shearing had asked about repairing such a hole suggested that he had knowledge of the crime that had not been released to the public. The tip about Shearing's inquiry led investigators to focus their attention on him as a potential suspect. They began conducting background checks and surveillance to learn more about his activities and associations. The investigation revealed that Shearing lived in the local area and would have had the knowledge necessary to navigate the remote logging roads where both vehicles had been found. He also had access to firearms and would have been familiar with the wilderness areas where the murders had occurred. On the 19th of November 1983, more than 15 months after the murders, David William Shearing was arrested in Dawson Creek, British Columbia, on charges of second-degree murder in the deaths of the 6 members of the Johnson and Bentley families. The arrest came as a shock to local residents who knew Shearing as a seemingly ordinary young man from a respectable family. Shearing was transported under guard to Kamloops, where he was formally charged with the murders. The arrest marked the end of one of the most extensive manhunts in Canadian history and brought some measure of relief to the families and friends of the victims who had been waiting for justice. The charges against Shearing were based on the accumulated evidence that investigators had gathered during their lengthy investigation. While much of this evidence was circumstantial, investigators were confident that they had identified the right suspect and could build a strong case against him. The arrest also generated renewed media attention in the case, with reporters and news organizations covering the dramatic conclusion to the investigation that had captivated the Canadian public for more than a year. Initially, David Shearing maintained his innocence and denied any involvement in the murders of the Johnson and Bentley families. However, experienced RCMP investigators, Sergeant Mike Eastham and Constable Ken Liebel, were convinced of his guilt and worked methodically to break down his resistance and obtain a confession. The investigators used psychological pressure and carefully crafted questioning techniques to convince Shearing that cooperation would be in his best interest. They worked to gain his confidence while gradually confronting him with evidence that contradicted his claims of innocence. The breakthrough came when Shearing accidentally revealed information that had not been made public, specifically, that he knew the murders had been committed at Bear Creek. This knowledge could only have come from direct involvement in the crimes, since investigators had not released this detail to the public. Under continued pressure from the skilled interrogators, Shearing eventually broke down and confessed to murdering all 6 members of the 2 families. His confession provided investigators with details about the crimes that only the killer could have known, confirming their belief that they had caught the right person. On the day his trial was scheduled to begin, David Shearing made the decision to change his plea to guilty on all charges. Rather than face a jury trial where all the horrific details of his crimes would be presented in open court, he chose to admit his guilt and accept responsibility for the murders. As part of his guilty plea, Shearing was required to provide a written statement describing how he had committed the crimes. However, the statement he provided was a fabrication designed to minimize the most disturbing aspects of his crimes, particularly the sexual assault and extended captivity of the 2 young girls. In his false confession, Shearing claimed, "I walked out of the bush from behind the camper and started shooting. I put the bodies in the car, 4 in the back seat and the 2 little ones in the trunk. I poured gasoline. It just went, whoomph. I stood back and watched it burn. I went to the tent. I knelt down, and I shot the other 2. This version of events was completely fabricated and bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. The real crimes were far more prolonged and horrific, involving days of sexual torture and abuse that Shearing was desperately trying to conceal, even as he admitted his guilt to the murders themselves. On the 16th of April 1984, Supreme Court Justice Harry Mackay sentenced David William Shearing to 6 concurrent terms of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for the judge to address the unprecedented nature of the crimes and their impact on the victims' families and the broader community. In his 10-minute summation, Justice Mackay described the crime in terms that captured the horror and senselessness of what Shearing had done. What we have, very simply, is a cold-blooded and senseless execution of 6 defenseless and innocent people for no apparent reason. This case is at the upper range of culpability. The judge continued, "The sentence I impose, in conjunction with such matters as protection of the public and specific deterrence, must have proper regard for public opinion and must express, in clear terms, the revulsion felt by the great majority of our citizens for this senseless and vicious mass killing." Justice Mackay emphasized that there were no mitigating factors that could excuse or explain Shearing's actions. The victims were unknown to the prisoner. They did not, in any way, provoke him. He knew they were camped at the site and carefully scouted the situation. He went home and returned either that night or the next with a loaded .22 rifle. The enormity of the crimes demanded the maximum sentence. While Shearing's fabricated confession had painted the murders as a quick, almost impulsive act of violence, the reality was far more disturbing. Over the years, through various parole hearings and psychological evaluations, the full extent of his crimes would gradually be revealed, showing that his actions were even more depraved than initially understood. During parole hearings in later decades, Shearing would admit that he had stalked the family for days before attacking them, becoming fixated on 3-year-old Janet Johnson. He revealed that his primary motivation was sexual, and that he had harbored violent sexual fantasies involving rape and murder since his mid-teens. Most horrifically, he eventually admitted that he had kept the 2 girls alive for nearly a week after murdering the adults, during which time he repeatedly sexually assaulted them. This period of captivity would have been unimaginably terrifying for Janet and Karen, who were completely helpless and at the mercy of their parents' killer. The revelation that Shearing had tortured the girls for days before finally killing them added another layer of horror to crimes that were already considered among the most brutal in Canadian history. It also explained why he had been so reluctant to provide accurate details about his crimes, even when confessing to the murders. The sentencing brought some measure of closure to the extended families of the victims, who had endured more than a year and a half of uncertainty and grief while waiting for answers about what had happened to their loved ones. However, no sentence could ever truly compensate for the magnitude of their loss. The murders had devastated multiple families, who had lost not just individual loved ones, but entire family units that represented the past, present, and future of their family lines. The grandparents who had worked their whole lives to create a legacy for their descendants were gone. The parents who had dedicated themselves to raising their children were gone. The children who represented hope for the future were gone. For surviving family members, the knowledge that their loved ones had suffered so terribly before dying added an extra dimension to their grief. The thought of what Janet and Karen had endured during their days of captivity was particularly agonizing for relatives who had known them as happy, innocent children. The sentencing at least provided some assurance that Shearing would never be able to harm another family in the same way. His life sentence, with no possibility of parole for 25 years, meant that he would be an old man before he could even be considered for release, and the severity of his crimes made it unlikely that he would ever be granted parole. The murders of the Johnson and Bentley families forever changed Wells Gray Provincial Park and the surrounding Clearwater Valley. What had once been seen as a pristine wilderness destination for family camping trips was now associated with one of Canada's most horrific mass murders. Park officials and tourism operators in the region had to grapple with the challenge of maintaining the area's reputation as a safe and welcoming destination while acknowledging the terrible tragedy that had occurred there. Memorial plaques and other tributes to the victims helped ensure that their memory would be preserved, but the shadow of the murders continued to influence how people thought about the area. For many families, the Wells Gray murders served as a stark reminder that even in Canada's vast wilderness areas, evil could strike without warning. The random nature of the crime, a family targeted simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, made it particularly terrifying for other camping families who realized that it could just as easily have been them. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of families camping in remote areas where help was far away and where predators could operate without fear of detection. Many families began taking additional precautions when camping, avoiding isolated locations and being more vigilant about their surroundings. Impact on Canadian law enforcement. The Wells Gray murders had a significant impact on how Canadian law enforcement agencies approach missing persons cases and major crime investigations. The initial focus on the theory that the killers had fled to eastern Canada, while ultimately proven wrong, demonstrated the importance of not abandoning local investigations too quickly. The case showed the value of persistent, methodical police work and the importance of following up on seemingly minor tips and observations. The breakthrough in the case came from a casual comment about Shearing's inquiry about repairing a bullet hole in a truck door, exactly the kind of detail that might have been overlooked in a less thorough investigation. The success of the investigation also demonstrated the effectiveness of psychological interrogation techniques when applied by skilled investigators. The ability of Sergeants Eastham and Liebel to obtain a confession from Shearing was crucial to securing his conviction and ensuring that justice was served. The case became a training example for law enforcement agencies across Canada, illustrating both the challenges and the potential solutions involved in investigating complex crimes in remote areas. Changes in parole procedures. The ongoing parole applications by David Shearing have also influenced discussions about Canada's parole system, particularly regarding offenders who have committed extremely violent crimes. The case has become a focal point for debates about whether some crimes are so heinous that the perpetrators should never be eligible for parole. The repeated trauma experienced by victim families during parole hearings has led to calls for reforms that would reduce the frequency of parole applications for certain types of offenders. Some advocates argue that mass murderers like Shearing should not be allowed to apply for parole repeatedly, forcing families to relive their trauma every few years. The strong public opposition to Shearing's potential release has also demonstrated the role that community sentiment plays in parole decisions. The thousands of signatures on petitions opposing his release show that the public has not forgotten his crimes and does not believe he should ever be freed. Media and cultural impact. The Wells Gray murders have been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, television programs, and podcast episodes, ensuring that the story continues to reach new audiences decades after the crimes occurred. These media presentations have helped keep the memory of the victims alive while also serving as cautionary tales about the potential dangers that can lurk in seemingly safe environments. The case was featured as episode 1 of the CBC television series, The Detectives, in 2018, introducing the story to a new generation of viewers. The detailed presentation of the investigation and its eventual resolution provided insight into how complex criminal cases are solved through persistent police work. Books like Murder x6, The True Story of the Wells Gray Park Murders by Alan R. Warren have provided in-depth examinations of the case, exploring not only the crimes themselves but also their impact on the families, the community, and the criminal justice system. The continued media interest in the case reflects its status as one of Canada's most notorious crimes and its ongoing relevance to discussions about public safety, criminal justice, and the protection of families. The ongoing fight for justice. Today, nearly 43 years after the murders, the fight for justice continues. David Shearing remains in prison, now 65 years old, serving his life sentence at a federal institution. While he has been denied parole multiple times, he will likely continue to apply for release as long as the law allows him to do so. The families of the victims continue to advocate against his release, supported by thousands of Canadians who believe that some crimes are so terrible that they warrant permanent imprisonment. Their ongoing efforts to keep Shearing behind bars represent a form of continued service to society, protecting future potential victims from a man who has shown no genuine remorse for his actions. The case serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of vigilance in protecting our families and communities from predators who may appear normal on the surface but harbor deadly intentions. It also demonstrates the resilience of victim families who have channeled their grief into efforts to prevent similar tragedies from occurring. As we reflect on the Wells Gray murders more than 4 decades later, it is crucial that we remember this story not primarily as a tale of evil and violence, but as a tribute to 6 innocent people whose lives were cut short by senseless brutality. Bob and Jackie Johnson, George and Edith Bentley, and their daughters Janet and Karen were real people with hopes, dreams, and plans for the future that were destroyed by one man's twisted desires. Bob Johnson was remembered by his co-workers as one of the most reliable and dedicated employees they had ever known. His 25-year perfect attendance record spoke to his character and his commitment to providing for his family. He died trying to protect the people he loved most, demonstrating courage in the face of unimaginable evil. Jackie Johnson was a devoted wife and mother who had looked forward to the family camping trip as an opportunity to create lasting memories with her children and parents. Her love for her family was evident in everything she did, and her death left a void that could never be filled. George and Edith Bentley represented the best of their generation, people who had worked hard their entire lives and were now enjoying the rewards of spending time with their children and grandchildren. They had invested in camping equipment specifically so they could take trips like this with their family, and they died while engaged in one of their favorite activities. 13-year-old Janet Johnson was on the cusp of womanhood, with all the potential and promise that comes with being a bright, talented young person. Her death robbed the world of whatever contributions she might have made, and her family of the joy of watching her grow into adulthood. 11-year-old Karen Johnson embodied the innocence and wonder of childhood. Her trust in the safety and security provided by her family made her particularly vulnerable to the evil that entered their lives, and her death represented the loss of pure innocence that can never be recovered. The broader lessons. The Wells Gray murders teach us several important lessons about the nature of evil and the importance of remaining vigilant in protecting our families and communities. First, they demonstrate that predators often hide behind facades of normalcy, appearing to be ordinary members of society while harboring deadly intentions. David Shearing came from what appeared to be a respectable family and had completed his education and job training. To casual observers, he would have seemed like a normal young man trying to make his way in the world. This case reminds us that evil does not always announce itself in obvious ways. Second, the case shows us the importance of trusting our instincts and reporting suspicious behavior to authorities. The breakthrough in the investigation came from someone who remembered Shearing asking about repairing a bullet hole in a truck door, a detail that seemed minor at the time but proved crucial to solving the case. Third, the murders highlight the vulnerability of families in remote locations where help is far away and where criminals can operate without fear of immediate detection. While we should not allow fear to prevent us from enjoying outdoor activities, we must remain aware of our surroundings and take reasonable precautions to protect ourselves and our loved ones. The importance of justice. The eventual capture, conviction, and continued imprisonment of David Shearing demonstrates that justice, while sometimes slow, can ultimately prevail. The dedicated work of investigators who refused to give up on the case, even when leads seemed to go nowhere, ensured that the killer was brought to account for his crimes. The ongoing efforts to keep Shearing in prison show that justice is not just about punishment, but also about protection. Every parole hearing that results in his continued imprisonment is a victory for public safety and a testament to the effectiveness of victim advocacy. The case also illustrates the importance of supporting victim families, not just immediately after crimes occur, but throughout the long process of seeking justice. The families of the Johnson and Bentley murder victims have shown remarkable strength and persistence in continuing to advocate against Shearing's release decades after their loved ones were killed. A legacy of awareness. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Wells Gray murders is the increased awareness they have created about the potential dangers that can threaten families in seemingly safe environments. The case has educated countless people about the importance of situational awareness and the need to report suspicious behavior. The continued media coverage of the case, including documentaries, books, and podcast episodes, ensures that new generations learn about these crimes and the lessons they teach. This ongoing education helps prevent similar tragedies by making people more aware of potential threats. The case has also contributed to improvements in law enforcement techniques, victim services, and public safety policies. The investigation methods used to solve the Wells Gray murders have been studied and refined, helping to improve the response to similar crimes. Today, Wells Gray Provincial Park continues to welcome thousands of visitors each year who come to enjoy its natural beauty and outdoor recreation opportunities. The park's 39 waterfalls, dramatic mountain peaks, and wilderness trails remain as stunning as they were in 1982, offering families the chance to create positive memories in nature. However, those who visit the park today do so with a greater awareness of the potential dangers that can exist even in paradise. The story of the Johnson and Bentley families serves as a permanent reminder that we must remain vigilant in protecting those we love, even in places where we feel safe and secure. The memorial tributes to the 6 victims ensure that they are not forgotten, and their story continues to serve as both a warning about the existence of evil and a testament to the importance of family love. Bob and Jackie Johnson, George and Edith Bentley, Janet and Karen Johnson died while doing something they loved, 2-5, spending time together as a family in one of Canada's most beautiful wilderness areas. Their deaths were senseless and brutal, but their memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved them and in the lessons their story teaches about the preciousness of life and the importance of protecting the innocent. As long as people remember their story, the Johnson and Bentley families will not have died in vain. David Shearing may have succeeded in destroying 6 lives, but he did not succeed in destroying the love that bound this family together, or the impact their story has had on countless others. In the end, love and justice have proven stronger than evil and violence, ensuring that the victims are remembered not just as statistics in a crime story, but as real people whose lives had meaning and whose deaths demand that we never forget the importance of protecting the innocent from those who would do them harm. That's it for today's video covering the horrific scenes throughout different decades. If you found this deep dive into true crime compelling and want to see more detailed investigations into cases like the Bennett family massacre, the Griquastad farm murders, and other shocking crimes that have captivated the world, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps us continue bringing you these comprehensive, well-researched true crime documentaries that honor the victims while exploring the darkest corners of human behavior. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, and let us know in the comments which cases you'd like us to cover next. Until next time, stay safe out there.